Hi everyone, welcome to Red Umbrella. I hope you're all doing well. Today we'll be looking at 3 disturbing theories for every Family Guy character. We are covering 6 main characters with 3 theories each, examining the psychological patterns and behavioral evidence that emerge across hundreds of episodes. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Section 1. Internalized weapon theory. The internalized weapon theory is one of the darkest ways to look at Meg Griffin, and it changes everything about how we understand her character. Most people see Meg as Family Guy's punching bag, the girl who just takes abuse from everyone around her. But this theory says something way more disturbing is happening. Meg hasn't just learned to take the abuse, she's learned to turn it into a weapon she uses against herself. Years of embarrassment, being ignored, and getting rejected by classmates have taught Meg to hurt herself before anyone else can. She doesn't just suffer passively. She actively takes all that mistreatment and turns it into destructive patterns that damage her first and sometimes explode outward at others. This matters because it changes Meg from a sad victim into someone who actively participates in her own destruction, which is way darker than the surface comedy suggests. To understand how Meg got this way, you have to look at her baseline situation across the early and middle seasons of the show. She lives in a house where Peter regularly forgets she exists. Lois brushes off her concerns as annoying. Chris joins in on attacking her to stay in the family's good graces, and even Brian barely notices her unless the plot needs him to. At school, things are just as bad. Connie D'Amico and her group treat Meg like a human punching bag, sometimes literally. Meg gets pelted with dodgeballs while coaches pretend not to see, left out of social events, and publicly embarrassed in front of classmates who either join in or just watch silently. This two-front attack from home and school leaves Meg with nowhere safe to go, and nobody consistently telling her she matters. She never gets that positive feedback that most people need to feel okay about themselves. Instead of building up defenses or trying to escape, Meg adapts by accepting that she's worthless. She starts expecting rejection before it happens, putting herself down before anyone else can, and treating mistreatment as just her normal life. This mindset sets up the more extreme stuff the theory talks about. When nobody ever approves of her, Meg creates her own internal punishment systems that copy what her family does to her. You can see evidence of this across multiple seasons in episodes that show Meg not just taking abuse, but absorbing it into something she controls. The pattern really shows up in how Meg chases relationships and deals with them falling apart. In Dial Meg for Murder, which aired on January 31st, 2010 as the 11th episode of Season 8, Meg connects with Luke, a prisoner she meets through a school pen pal program. The relationship itself shows how damaged Meg's attachment system is. She's drawn to someone literally locked up, separated from the world by walls and guards, because that barrier feels safe. Luke can't abandon her the normal way because he physically can't leave. When Brian finds out about the relationship and tells Peter and Lois, Meg defends her choice by saying she and Luke really connect very deeply, and that he's all alone in there and I'm all alone out here. She's directly comparing her home life to being in prison. Lois dismisses Luke's story about robbing a store to pay for his mom's medicine as a convincing sob story and forbids Meg from seeing him. The family's reaction confirms what Meg already believes. Her emotional needs are just inconvenient problems, not real concerns worth addressing. When Luke escapes during a prison riot and hides at the Griffin house, Meg hides him even though she knows it's a felony. She gets arrested and goes to prison herself. The big moment comes when Meg returns from prison 3 months later, completely changed into a hardened criminal. She comes back with a new, tough appearance and immediately starts getting revenge on her family for years of built-up abuse. The violence is targeted and specific. Meg beats Peter senseless in multiple scenes, showing physical power over the dad who spent years making her feel small. She sexually assaults Peter in the shower with a loofah, flipping the power dynamic in the most invasive way possible. She uses Lois's shirts as toilet paper and keeps a, quote, poop bucket in her room, degrading her mom's stuff the way her mom degraded her self-worth. When Meg goes back to school, Connie D'Amico and her friends make the mistake of mocking her. Meg attacks them brutally, putting her foot on Connie's head and curb stomping her in a scene that directly copies American History X. The episode plays this violence as satisfying comedy, but what's underneath is disturbing. Meg didn't learn to be aggressive in prison. Prison just gave her permission to let out what was already inside her. The weapon was always there. Being locked up just removed the safety, keeping it hidden. Brian eventually calms Meg down by reading his Teen People article, calling her far sweeter and kinder than the typical American girl. The nice words reach her, and Meg goes back to how she was before. But that return to normal is actually troubling. Meg doesn't work through her trauma or set boundaries. She just pushes the rage back down because someone finally said something nice. The internalized weapon stays loaded. Seahorse Seashell Party, the second episode of Season 10, which aired on October 2nd, 2011, gives the clearest proof of Meg turning the weapon on herself. During a hurricane that traps the Griffin family inside, the usual treatment gets worse. The family plays finger bang and leaves Meg out, telling her to do it to herself. Peter hums Indiana Jones music and snaps at Meg for distracting him. After years of stored-up abuse, Meg finally snaps. She goes after Chris first, calling him a bastard for never taking her side, and asking if he gets what it feels like to be constantly insulted by her own brother. She turns to Lois next, bringing up her criminal past, drug addiction, and sexual history. She tells Lois she's the furthest thing from a perfect mother, and says she's thinking about never seeing Lois again after she turns 18. Peter thinks Meg's speech is funny at first, laughing at her insults until she calls him a waste of a man. She describes him as a fat, lazy, abusive, blue-collar Irish Catholic dad who drinks too much and would go to jail if anyone outside the family saw how he treats her. The family turns on each other within seconds. Peter runs upstairs crying. Chris yells that he faked all his orgasms. The house falls into total chaos. The key detail comes when Meg talks alone with Brian afterward. She decides that her family can't survive without some sort of lightning rod to absorb all the dysfunction. She willingly goes back to her old role, apologizing to everyone and accepting that her lot in life is to feel bad so they don't have to. Brian calls this incredibly noble and mature, and tells Meg she might be the strongest person in this house. The fan and critic reaction to Seahorse Seashell Party was strongly negative, and the reason ties directly to the internalized weapon. Theory. Kevin McFarland of the AV Club gave the episode a D+, saying Family Guy spent years going down the path of least resistance and simply joined the fan chorus of hatred toward Meg, and that one episode of pointed, forced justification for that shift doesn't change a thing. Teron Moore of Ology rated it 4.5 out of 10, calling it an episode that spends a lot of time addressing something that didn't need to be addressed. The episode has a 6.6 rating on IMDb, way below average for the series. User reviews often express anger at how it ends. Multiple viewers describe the ending as teaching people to stay as a punching bag for their abuser's benefit. The backlash focuses on Meg's choice after her confrontation, where she willingly accepts being the family's emotional punching bag. The long-term effects of these episodes lock Meg into her position as someone who has turned outside abuse into an internal operating system. Lego My Mego, which aired on May 6, 2012 as the 20th episode of Season 10, shows Meg escaping to Paris after Connie attacks her with dodgeballs during gym. She immediately gets kidnapped by human traffickers and sold at a sex slave auction. The episode's darkest moment comes when a prince buys Meg and actually wants to marry her. For one brief moment, she has a chance to leave her abusive family forever and live with someone who values her. She says yes. Then Brian and Stewie kill the prince during their rescue, and Stewie erases Meg's memory of everything. Meg goes home with no memory that anyone ever chose her or that escape was even possible. The theory says this isn't accidental storytelling. Meg has been trained to expect rejection and failure so completely that the universe itself seems to agree. The weapon isn't her family's cruelty. The weapon is Meg's acceptance of that cruelty as the only reality she can have. Moving on, we have the identity dissociation theory. Section 2. Identity dissociation theory. The identity dissociation theory takes a hard look at why Meg Griffin can't seem to hold on to a consistent sense of who she is. The basic idea is that Meg's real personality only gets negative reactions from her family and classmates. So instead of building a real self through normal teenage experimenting, she cycles through different fake identities that promise escape from being invisible and ignored. These identities aren't about growing as a person. They're survival tools. Meg becomes an obsessive stalker, a glamorous starlet, or an invisible victim, depending on which version of herself seems to get rewarded in that moment. The disturbing part isn't that Meg tries on different identities, because most teenagers do that. It's that she completely abandons each identity when it fails to get her acceptance. There's no real Meg underneath the performances. The theory says the real Meg got erased so early and so completely that only these adaptive masks are left, each one ready to be thrown away when things change. The groundwork for this identity problem shows up in how the Griffin household reacts to Meg being there versus not being there. When Meg fills her default role as the invisible family member, she gets either contempt or complete indifference. Peter regularly forgets her name or mistakes her for objects. Lois dismisses her concerns as distractions from more important stuff. Chris joins attacks on Meg to protect his own shaky spot in the family ranking. This constant devaluation teaches Meg that her real self has negative worth. The logical response is to become someone else completely. Meg learns early that her authentic identity is a problem. Any persona that gets positive attention, even for a short time, becomes better than the self that gets none at all. This creates a pattern where Meg doesn't add new experiences to a growing identity, but instead swaps out her entire personality whenever something else seems like it might work. The swaps are always temporary because they depend on outside approval that always goes away eventually. Barely Legal, which aired on December 17th, 2006 as the 8th episode of Season 5, gives the clearest example of how Meg forms these dissociated identities. The episode starts with Meg threatening suicide because she can't find a date to her junior prom. The threat itself shows how completely Meg's self-worth depends on getting romantic approval from others. When Brian agrees to take her as a last resort, Meg walks into prom as a different person. She has a date. She matters. Brian, getting more and more drunk through the night, gives a speech to Connie D'Amico, explaining that Connie bullies Meg because Connie developed sexually early, started giving sexual favors at 12, and now can't look at herself in the mirror without seeing someone degraded. The speech embarrasses Connie and positions Brian as Meg's defender. In the emotional aftermath, Brian and Meg kiss. The kiss transforms Meg instantly. She stops being desperate, invisible Meg and becomes someone with a romantic partner. The identity shift is total and immediate. The main event of Barely Legal shows Meg's dissociated pattern at its most extreme. After the prom kiss, Meg starts treating Brian as her boyfriend, even though Brian clearly says he has no romantic interest in her and is already dating Jillian. Meg's response isn't disappointment, but denial. She bakes Brian a pie using her own hair, implied to be pubic hair, as an ingredient. She follows him obsessively, trying to force herself into his daily routines. When Brian goes to Meg's room to clearly set boundaries, telling her straight up that he's not attracted to her, Meg refuses to accept the rejection. That night, she knocks Brian out with a bag of dog food, puts him in the trunk of his car, and drives to the Barrington Hotel. She ties Brian up with packaging tape and gets ready to rape him. The family tracks them down and finds Meg about to assault Brian while insisting she's never been more sure of anything in her life. The episode directly references Fatal Attraction, with Meg turning lights on and off while playing opera and declaring, "I will not be ignored, Brian." Meg hasn't just developed a crush. She's completely disconnected from her previous identity and built a new one where she's the romantic aggressor, the woman who takes what she wants, the opposite of invisible Meg. The persona is psychotic, but it's also a complete alternative to her default self. What nobody really looked at was how fast Meg went from suicidal despair to predatory obsession, and how the episode gets resolved by having Quagmire tell Meg she doesn't need a boyfriend to enjoy being a teenager. Quagmire gives her a copy of Shel Silverstein's The Missing Piece, and apparently talks her down from her obsessive state. The resolution requires Meg to completely drop her stalker persona and go back to baseline invisibility. She does this without any trouble, which suggests that neither suicidal Meg nor predatory Meg were real identities. They were costumes she put on and took off based on what was happening around her. Don't Make Me Over, the 4th episode of Season 4, which aired on June 5th, 2005, shows the same pattern with a different persona. After Craig Hoffman turns down Meg's request for a date, Meg looks for family support and gets mockery instead. Peter tries to say he always thought Meg was beautiful, but can't finish the sentence without laughing. Lois takes Meg to the mall for a makeover done by Trisha Takanawa. Meg comes out transformed into a conventionally attractive blonde, and Peter's immediate reaction is to welcome her to the family and tell Chris to burn all her old pictures. The family only accepts Meg when she becomes someone they don't recognize. The critical and audience reaction to Barely Legal was mostly positive, with the episode getting a 7.8 rating on IMDb and praise for its cultural references. But the Parent Television Council criticized the episode's content, and the deeper psychology of Meg's transformation didn't get much attention at the time. In Don't Make Me Over, a record producer spots the family doing karaoke and signs them specifically because of Meg's new look. Doctor. Diddy explains that putting her half-naked up front center stage will make them billionaires because America loves hot white jailbait. Meg's mom objects, but Meg cuts her off with, "Shut up, Mom, I want to be exploited." Beautiful Meg is a completely different person than Invisible Meg. She demands Skittles from Lois and asks if Lois freaking stuttered. She declares that she is the band, and everyone else doesn't matter. When the family performs on Saturday Night Live, Meg loses her virginity to Jimmy Fallon on live TV without realizing it's being broadcast. The episode ends with Meg choosing to go back to her old appearance, saying, "Being beautiful is too much work." She doesn't learn from the experience. She just takes off the costume and goes back to her default identity. The long-term effects of Meg's identity dissociation show up across multiple seasons, and how the show treats her transformations as always temporary. Road to the Multiverse, the Season 8 premiere, shows alternate universe versions of Meg, including a conventionally attractive, popular girl in a universe where everything is drawn Disney-style. The episode suggests that Meg's unattractiveness and unpopularity only exist in her home universe, rather than being essential parts of who she is. Yet Meg never uses this information to change anything. She goes back to baseline invisibility after every episode that gives her an alternative. The dissociation theory explains this pattern. Meg doesn't have a stable self that could take in transformative experiences. She has a series of disconnected personas that turn on and off based on outside conditions. When the conditions that supported Beautiful Meg, or Stalker Meg, disappear, those identities vanish completely. Only Invisible Meg sticks around, not because that identity is more real, but because the Griffin household keeps recreating the conditions that produce it. Meg's identity isn't disconnected from reality. It's disconnected from itself. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the Manufactured Failure Theory. Section 3, Manufactured Failure Theory. The Manufactured Failure Theory looks at why Meg Griffin loses at literally everything, and it turns out it's not just bad luck or her being untalented. This theory says that Meg's family, her classmates, and basically everyone in Quahog actually works together to make sure she fails. They set up situations where she can't win, and then, when she loses, they act like it proves she was always a loser. This matters to our breakdown because it shows that Meg isn't failing on her own. The people around her are actively building traps that guarantee her defeat. Connie D'Amico needs someone to look down on. Peter needs someone to take his frustrations out on without feeling guilty. The whole Quahog system needs a permanent loser at the bottom, and everyone works together to make sure Meg stays in that spot no matter what she does. You can see how manufactured failure works when you look at how Meg's attempts to succeed get sabotaged before they even get a chance. In a normal world, a teenager who applies for an internship, tries out for a team, or asks someone on a date might win or lose based on her own abilities and effort. But in Meg's world, these everyday teenage activities are rigged from the start. When Meg applies for opportunities, she only gets picked because she's not a threat to anyone. When she actually does something well, everyone acts like it was an accident or she didn't deserve it. When she fails, everyone nods like they always knew it would happen. The scary part is that Meg could be smart, talented, and totally likable, and the result would still be the same, because the outcome is decided before she even tries. The Kiss Scene Around the World, which aired on August 29th, 2001 as the 8th episode of Season 3, shows this pattern perfectly through what looks like a good opportunity at first. Channel 5 News announces they want 2 high school interns, and Meg applies because she has a crush on anchor Tom Tucker. She gets picked, but not because anyone thinks she's qualified or hardworking. Diane Simmons specifically chooses Meg because all the other applicants were too pretty and might steal Tom's attention. Meg gets the job because she's not a threat. Her fellow intern turns out to be Neil Goldman, the most hated kid at James Woods Regional High School, which just confirms how low Meg's status really is. The internship pairs her with the one person everyone considers beneath her socially. When the mass media murderer threatens Mayor Adam West, Tom and Diane send the teenage interns to cover the dangerous story instead of going themselves, figuring the murderer will probably kill whoever shows up first. Meg and Neil are completely disposable to them. The news helicopter gets shot down, and thinking she's about to die, Meg feels sad that she never had her first kiss. She kisses Neil out of pure desperation because she doesn't want to die without experiencing that. What happens after the kiss makes the manufactured failure completely obvious. Neil, showing his own issues, broadcasts the kiss on the evening news without asking Meg first. The next day, he hands out t-shirts to the entire school, showing the image of Meg kissing him. Her private moment of weakness becomes public embarrassment. She has to sit through dinner with Neil's family like they're actually a couple. Every escape route gets blocked. When Meg finally fights back by going on TV to say she hates Neil and only kissed him because she thought she was dying, she does street interviews asking if anyone would kiss Neil. Nobody will. Even Neil's own dad, Mort, covers his eyes in disgust when someone shows him his son's picture. Meg announces publicly that she never liked Neil and never will. But this statement, which was supposed to get her dignity back, instead makes Neil threaten to jump off the city hall roof. Meg's attempt to escape her manufactured failure creates a situation where she looks responsible for someone maybe killing themselves. She literally cannot win. When she accepts Neil, she gets embarrassed. When she rejects him, she gets blamed for his reaction. Tom Tucker shows up at the scene and starts planning how to add cartoon sound effects to footage of Neil falling. Meg's childhood crush turns out to be a guy who would use a teenager's death for ratings. Even her romantic dreams are designed to fail. The episode ends with Meg breaking Neil's fall, only to find out he never actually planned to jump. He faked the whole suicide threat just to manipulate her into staying with him. Every single time Meg tries to take control of her life, the outcome just puts her right back in her role as Quahog's designated victim. A Fistful of Meg, the fourth episode of Season 12, which aired on November 10th, 2013, takes manufactured failure to life or death stakes. The episode starts with Meg accidentally spilling her lunch tray on new student Mike Pulaski, nicknamed Mental Mike because he supposedly knifed a kid on the playground and then beat up the knife. Mike announces he's going to destroy Meg at 3 o'clock on Friday. A death threat over a simple accident shows exactly how Quahog treats Meg. Any tiny mistake she makes deserves the worst possible punishment. Meg's attempts to get out of the situation all fail, one by one. She tries to transfer schools, but Lois brushes off the request by mentioning a Facebook page with over 2,000 likes, encouraging Meg to kill herself, like this is just normal for Meg. She tries to get expelled so she won't be at school for the fight, but they refuse to expel her. She tries to hire athletes to protect her, but Mike beats them all up. Her own friends abandon her, saying they need to hide for their own safety. The principal doesn't step in. Instead, Principal Shepard uses the morning announcements to remind students that all bets on Friday's Meg Griffin slaughter need to be on his desk by Thursday. Every single part of the school system works together to make sure Meg fails, treating her possible death as entertainment for everyone else. The episode got serious criticism from both viewers and critics. The AV Club review called the Meg content face-melting awful and pointed out that Family Guy's biggest sin in treating Meg like an animal isn't even that the joke is offensive, it's that it's unfunny. The Parents Television Council filed an FCC complaint about the episode's disturbing imagery and how it showed bullying. The episode has a 6.7 rating on IMDb, way below the series average. Fan discussions often call it one of the worst examples of Meg abuse in the show's entire run. The critical response actually proves the manufactured failure theory. Audiences could tell that the episode went past comedy into something that was mean on purpose. The joke wasn't that Meg faced problems. The joke was that every system meant to protect teenagers, family, school, friends, all work together to guarantee her destruction. Quagmire's intervention, teaching Meg to use her gross body as a weapon, just confirms that Meg's only resource is her own degradation. The long-term effects of manufactured failure show up in how the show never lets Meg escape the system that creates her losses. Unlike other Griffin family members who sometimes win or grow, Meg's story is defined by constant defeat. When she wins, like she technically does against Mental Mike by grossing him out until his face melts, the victory gets shown as disgusting rather than triumphant. The episode ends with narration revealing Meg dies a year later from septic shock caused by a frozen hot dog. Even her survival is temporary. Even her wins contain the seeds of future embarrassment. Quahog needs someone at the bottom. The Griffins need someone to abuse without feeling bad. Meg's failures aren't really hers. They're manufactured by everyone around her, episode after episode, season after season. Next up is the control through competence theory. Section 4. Control through competence theory. The control through competence theory explains why Lois Griffin sits in such a weird position in the Family Guy household. She's clearly the most capable adult in the house, but she's also the most constantly ignored authority figure. This theory says that Lois keeps the household running not through love or real partnership with Peter, but through a mix of emotional management and being so good at everything that nobody can function without her. She handles Peter's chaos, sorts out the kids' problems, and deals with every crisis because being competent is her main way of staying in control. This matters because it reveals that without constant problems to fix, Lois wouldn't have a clear role in her own family. She might even keep manageable chaos going without realizing it, because it proves why everyone needs her around. The basic setup shows up in almost every episode and creates the conditions for Lois's control system. Peter can't handle basic adult responsibilities. He forgets appointments, destroys property, puts the kids in danger, and needs constant watching to avoid disasters. His job at the Pawtucket Brewery barely pays anything, and Lois has to stretch every dollar to cover bills. Chris has learning issues and social problems that need ongoing parent involvement. His friendship with the evil monkey in his closet and his struggles at school create regular problems that only Lois takes seriously. Meg needs emotional support that Lois gives inconsistently, switching between rare moments of actual mom support and joining in when the family mocks her. Stewie's genius creates issues that only adult attention can handle, though Lois mostly misses his world domination plans and time travel adventures. Brian, despite acting intellectual, creates relationship drama and drinking problems that complicate household life. Every family member makes problems. Lois solves problems. This setup makes her the center that everything orbits around. Breaking out is hard to do. The 9th episode of Season 4, which aired on July 17, 2005, gives us the clearest test of the control through competence theory by taking Lois out of the household completely. The episode starts with Lois finding out she's short on cash while grocery shopping. Instead of putting a ham back, she hides it in her purse and steals it. The theft gives her an immediate rush that she hasn't felt in years of running the household. She describes feeling a void in my life and a secret hole in me that she was trying to fill with expensive objects and things. She quickly starts stealing more and more valuable stuff, including jewelry, electronics, and eventually a Matisse painting from the Quahog Museum of Art. Brian notices the new items showing up at the house and gets suspicious. He confronts her at an auto parts store where she's stealing car mufflers. Brian tells Lois what she's doing is wrong and compares her to the Winona Ryder shoplifting incident. Lois accepts his point and genuinely plans to return everything. She loads the stolen stuff into her car, but Joe Swanson arrests her before she can give anything back. In court, Lois apologizes and seems ready to accept a light sentence for a first offense. But when she notices the judge's gavel, she can't stop herself from stealing it. The judge gives her 2 years, extended to 3 after Peter's outbursts. The big moment happens during Lois's time in prison, when the Griffin household immediately falls apart without her there to hold it together. Peter can't handle basic household tasks. The house fills up with garbage, dirty dishes, and filth everywhere. Peter hasn't even showered. Chris struggles with basic daily needs. Stewie, in one scene, begs for help because he hasn't been able to use the bathroom properly, saying he can't fit any more inside himself. The family's quick collapse shows they have zero independent survival skills. They decide they have to break Lois out of prison, not because they miss her emotionally, but because they literally cannot survive without her running things. During a prison visit, Peter smuggles Lois out by stuffing her into his mouth, in a scene that ignores physical reality, but shows the family's desperate need to get their competent center back. The Griffins become fugitives, escaping to Quahog's Asian town, where they rent a rundown apartment and try to build new lives. Chris works as a rickshaw driver, finally finding a job he can actually do. Stewie takes a position at a sweatshop sewing shoes, but gets fired immediately after sewing a shoe to his own hand, and gets replaced by a newborn baby who's somehow more competent. Peter tries being a sumo wrestler, but fails at that too. Each family member's attempt at independence falls apart completely. Joe tracks them down after seeing Peter on TV and chases them through Asian Town in a long sequence that ends up in the city sewer. Lois eventually decides to turn herself in and face justice so her family won't have to keep suffering as fugitives. Right when she's about to get arrested, Joe slips on the wet sewer floor and almost falls to his death over a ledge. Lois saves him without even thinking, pulling him back from the edge. Because she saved him, Joe somehow gets her sentence canceled completely. The ending perfectly proves the theory's main point. Lois's heroic act of saving Joe is competence taking over again. She can't help but solve problems, even when the problem belongs to the cop trying to arrest her. She fixes her own legal trouble by solving someone else's crisis. Her family's complete inability to function while she was gone proved they were never meant to work on their own. Lois goes back to her spot as the essential center, and order returns because she's the only one who can keep it. The reception to Breaking Out is Hard to Do was mostly positive, with the episode getting a 7.6 rating on IMDb. Reviews praised the comedy of the Asian Town sequences, especially the Asian Tricks commercial parody and the AHA Take On Me rotoscope recreation with Chris. The production staff reportedly spent a lot of time figuring out Lois's motivation for the shoplifting spree, according to DVD commentary. They settled on the void explanation that frames her crimes as trying to fill the emptiness underneath her competent surface. Lois specifically says she was so sick of the same old routine and felt like I had a void in my life. The writers wanted to explore what would push Lois, the most stable Griffin, to such extreme behavior. The answer they landed on, a sense of emptiness, despite being competent and impossible to replace, directly supports the idea that Lois's control isn't actually satisfying for her. The long-term effects of the control through competence pattern show up in how the show keeps putting Lois back in her manager role, no matter what temporary escape she gets. The shoplifting episode ends with life going back to normal for the Griffins. Lois doesn't deal with the void that drove her to crime. She doesn't renegotiate her position in the family or make other members learn basic life skills. She doesn't get therapy or chase interests that might fill the emptiness she talked about. She just goes back to managing everyone else's chaos, because that's what Lois does and has always done. Other episodes show similar patterns. Whenever Lois chases her own interests, whether through work, creative stuff, or personal relationships, the story eventually puts her back as the competent center, holding everything together. She can't escape the role because the family depends entirely on her filling it. Lois controls the family through her competence, but her competence also controls her. She's both the warden and the prisoner of the system she keeps running. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the Submerged Resentment Theory. Section 5, Submerged Resentment Theory. The Submerged Resentment Theory looks at what's really going on beneath Lois Griffin's calm, capable surface, and what we find changes how we see her entire character. This theory says that Lois actually carries a lot of hidden anger toward her marriage, her kids, and the life that tied her to Peter Griffin, but she keeps most of it buried until it explodes out in certain moments. Lois was born into wealth and privilege as a Pewterschmidt. She had real talent with piano, training serious enough that she could have had a career in music. She went to fancy schools and had access to opportunities that marriage to Peter completely wiped out. This matters because it shows that Lois isn't just a patient wife dealing with a difficult husband. She's someone who gave up a lot and might be quietly angry about it every day, even if she rarely lets it show. To understand where Lois's anger comes from, you need to look at what she gave up and what she got in return. The Pewterschmidt family has old money and social status that goes back generations. Carter Pewterschmidt is a billionaire business owner with political connections and cultural influence that reaches far beyond Quahog. Lois grew up with servants, private education, European vacations, and advantages that set her up for a life completely different from Quahog's lower middle class chaos. Her piano training was serious enough that she taught lessons and performed publicly, which shows she had real talent that could have taken her somewhere big. Her early appearances in the show show she's smart, capable, and ambitious. But all that had nowhere to go after she married Peter Griffin. Peter brought chaos to Lois's organized life in every way. He brings money problems through random jobs and wasteful spending. He creates physical danger through his wild schemes. He causes social embarrassment through his public behavior and total lack of awareness. Peter basically needs constant management like a fourth child, rather than working as a partner who shares responsibilities. Lois's daily life is about cleaning up messes instead of chasing any goals of her own. The show sometimes talks about this through mentions of Lois's wilder past, her previous relationships with more accomplished guys, and her abandoned artistic interests. These moments hint at a different Lois who could have existed if she'd made different choices. The resentment theory says Lois knows exactly what she gave up, and that knowledge is always with her. Play It Again, Brian. The 10th episode of Season 6, which aired on March 2nd, 2008, brings Lois's hidden anger closest to the surface through her reaction to Peter's constant neglect and Brian's romantic attention. The episode opens with Peter and Lois having marriage problems because Peter always puts time with Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe above time with his wife. Lois planned a lunch with her parents that Peter completely forgot. She arranged activities that Peter either ignores or ruins through his selfishness. In one scene, she turns around, expecting Peter to be ready for their date, and finds him wearing full diving gear because he made different plans without telling her. She tries to stay patient, noting that their scheduled sex night will give some release that might ease the tension. When she turns around again, Peter's dressed in a beekeeper suit because he made last-minute plans with his friends instead. All these small betrayals add up. Lois isn't just disappointed by these constant letdowns. She's exhausted from years of being put second, years of ranking below Peter's friends, hobbies, and impulses. When Brian announces he won a literary award and invites them to Martha's Vineyard, Lois sees a chance to get the romantic attention Peter refuses to give her. The trip turns into a test of whether Lois's anger will beat out her commitment to her marriage. Peter immediately annoys Lois when they arrive, continuing his same pattern of selfishness without noticing how it affects her. When Peter makes his own plans without including her, Lois agrees to spend the day with Brian, and they have a great time together that reminds her what real connection feels like. That evening, Brian reads his award-winning essay at the ceremony, and it turns out to be entirely about Lois. He describes her as someone who exuded strength, life, laughter, and light, and says he feels sad that circumstance had bound her to my best friend. The essay directly says Lois is trapped by her marriage, saying out loud what Lois herself might never admit. She's clearly moved by his words in a way that shows how rarely anyone sees her this way. When Peter shows up drunk and embarrassing, announcing he somehow got engaged to Nathan Lane during bar adventures, Lois's disappointment gets even deeper. She chooses to spend the evening with Brian instead of dealing with Peter's mess. As they get ready for dinner, Brian starts having fantasies about telling Lois he loves her and kissing her. That evening, Brian loses control and tries hard to kiss Lois. She pushes him away and makes him leave, clearly upset by what happened. Brian later calls Stewie, saying he's no better than a rapist and showing real regret for crossing that line. The important part comes when Lois tells Peter the next morning. Peter confronts Brian at the hotel bar, angry and hurt. Brian tells Peter he doesn't deserve Lois, pointing to years of selfishness and neglect. Peter fires back that Brian's never kept a long-term relationship himself, using Jillian as an example. The argument turns into a physical fight before Nathan Lane breaks it up. After Peter and Brian make up, Lois talks privately with Brian about everything that happened. She forgives him, but then admits something huge. She tells Brian that sometimes she feels the same way about him. This admission proves the hidden anger that's been building for years. Lois is drawn to Brian not because he's especially attractive, but because he's an alternative to Peter, someone smart who writes essays about her strength instead of forgetting their anniversary. Her anger makes her vulnerable to anyone offering what Peter won't give. She ultimately stays faithful, but the choice is shown as genuinely hard rather than automatic. The episode got mixed reviews, holding a 7.2 rating on IMDb. Reviews focused mostly on Brian's behavior, which reviewers called predatory. TV Tropes commentary describes Brian as a designated hero whose attempt to get Lois drunk and throw himself at her gets brushed off as him loving her too much, despite aggression that borders on attempted rape. Peter himself correctly points out that Brian has no place criticizing his marriage given Brian's own history of failed relationships. The physical fight between Peter and Brian shows real conflict over Lois as a prize rather than a person making her own choices. What got less attention was Lois's admission that she shares those feelings. Her saying that she sometimes wants what Brian offers, escape from her marriage, gets treated as a brief moment of weakness, rather than proof she's been unhappy for a long time. The episode ends with the family singing "The Spirit of Massachusetts" and going back to Quahog like nothing happened. The anger that came to the surface immediately goes back under. Lois's hidden anger shows up in the same pattern of temptation and pushing it down over multiple seasons. Play It Again, Brian isn't the only episode where Lois shows attraction to someone other than Peter or unhappiness with her marriage. Earlier episodes established Brian's feelings, including Brian in Love from Season 2, where Brian figures out his attraction during therapy. Other episodes show Lois tempted by ex-boyfriends, attracted to dangerous men, or so exhausted by Peter that she considers alternatives. The show keeps letting her anger come to the surface, sometimes through rage, sometimes through flirtation, sometimes through open unhappiness, before resetting everything back to normal. Each reset makes Lois recommit to a marriage the show has shown doesn't meet her needs. She's angry about what she gave up for Peter. She's angry about what her life turned into. She's angry about the constant crisis management. But she can't act on this anger, because doing so would destroy the family structure and her identity as the capable wife and mother. So the anger stays buried, only coming up when pressure builds enough, then disappearing as soon as normal life continues. Up next is the Selective Morality Theory. Section 6. Selective Morality Theory. The Selective Morality Theory looks at how Lois Griffin handles right and wrong, and what it reveals is pretty troubling. This theory says that Lois has a way of dealing with ethics that changes based on how she feels, what benefits her personally, and what's convenient in the moment, rather than following the same rules all the time. Lois presents herself as the moral anchor of the Griffin household, the voice of reason who controls Peter's chaos and guides the kids toward acceptable behavior. But this theory says that presentation is more about looking good than actually believing it. When Lois's interests line up with normal ethics, she enforces those ethics hard and acts like the responsible one. When her interests clash with those same standards, she drops them without much internal struggle. This matters because the family's person, who's supposed to be the moral one, actually follows rules she created for everyone except herself. The setup for selective morality starts with understanding Lois's position as the person everyone turns to for questions about right and wrong. Peter doesn't really notice when his behavior is ethical or unethical in any consistent way. Chris follows whatever influence grabs his attention without thinking about morality at all. Meg has been so pushed aside that no one cares what she thinks about right and wrong within the family, regardless of whether she's right. Stewie has his own super smart thinking that the family can't understand and mostly ignores. Brian claims to be morally sophisticated, but shows over and over that his principles fall apart under minimal pressure when self-interest shows up. This leaves Lois as the only family member with both the standing and the stability to set moral guidelines for how everyone should act. She ends up in this role rather than earning it, since someone has to do it. The household needs someone to settle arguments, set limits, and decide when behavior crosses lines that need addressing. Lois fills this role because nobody else can, and because the alternative is complete moral chaos. The problem shows up when Lois uses her moral authority selectively, using these rules when they serve her interests, and throwing them away when they don't. The sun also draws. The 6th episode of Season 1, which aired on May 9th, 1999, gives an early example of Lois's selective morality through her response to Chris getting kicked out of the Scouts. The episode starts when Chris gets expelled from the Quahog Scout troop after accidentally setting fire to the Scoutmaster's car during a camping trip. Peter decides to take the family to Scout headquarters in New York to appeal the decision and get Chris back in. On the drive north, the family stops at an Indian casino where Lois discovers slot machines. She puts $1 into a machine, planning to play briefly while the family stretches their legs. What happens next is a fast and complete fall into gambling addiction that eats up all their travel money. Lois gets more and more absorbed in the flashing lights and spinning reels, telling herself she'll stop after winning back her losses, then continuing after each loss makes things worse. Peter eventually finds her still gambling hours later, having lost the family's entire trip budget through playing that she couldn't stop. The contrast between how Lois normally presents herself and how she acts at the casino is huge. She normally acts like the responsible adult who stops Peter's impulsive decisions from destroying the family's money and stability. At the casino, she becomes the impulsive one, while Peter tries to slow her down and remind her what they're supposed to be doing. When Peter points out they need to keep going to Scout headquarters for Chris's sake, Lois completely ignores what he's saying. Her gambling matters more than Chris's future with the Scouts. The selective morality shows in how fast and completely Lois abandons her usual priorities when personal pleasure enters the picture. The same woman who lectures Peter about responsibility can't pull herself away from a slot machine. The main event of the episode happens when Peter trades the family car for a van that breaks down on an Indian reservation, leaving them stranded without transportation or money. Chris wanders into the wilderness and meets tribal elders who recognize his artistic talent and encourage him to pursue drawing rather than fitting in to Scout expectations. Peter, desperate to get Chris back in and save the trip, lies to Scout leadership, claiming Chris has spiritual connections with Native American heritage that should exempt him from normal discipline. The Scouts accept this explanation and get ready to hold a ceremony based on Peter's complete lie. Lois knows Peter's lying. She watched him make up the story in real time and heard every false word. She understands the ceremony will be based on stealing Native American culture and straight-up fraud that takes advantage of Native American spiritual practices just to get her son back into Scouts. Yet she doesn't stop him. She doesn't step in to prevent the taking advantage of their culture or raise any objection. Her moral concerns, which would definitely show up if someone outside her family were doing this same fraud, stay completely silent when her family benefits from the lie. When Chris finally confesses that he has no Native American heritage and just wanted to draw, Lois supports his honesty and acts like she's on the side of truth. She lines up with ethical behavior after the lie has already fallen apart on its own, not before, when her stepping in might have stopped the whole fake ceremony. The episode ends with Chris being allowed to draw during Scout activities, a resolution everyone's comfortable with. Lois's gambling addiction disappears without anyone mentioning it again. Her selective morality creates no lasting impact, because the story moves on before anyone can look at her choices or hold her accountable. The reviews from critics and viewers for The Sun Also Draws focus mostly on the episode's humor and early series character development, rather than what it means for understanding Lois. The episode has a 7.4 rating on IMDb. Decent for a first season episode that was still figuring out the show's voice. Reviews at the time praised the road trip structure and Chris developing as a character with his own interests separate from his dad's influence. What got way less attention was the pattern the episode set up for Lois going forward. Her gambling addiction shows that her self-control only exists in certain situations and falls apart when she's tempted enough by immediate pleasure. Her failure to stop Peter's cultural fraud shows that her ethics are selective and only apply when enforcing them costs her nothing personally. These traits would come back throughout the series in bigger forms with higher stakes, but early viewers had no way to see them as patterns rather than one-time jokes. The long-term effects of Lois's selective morality show up in how later episodes repeat the pattern with bigger stakes and more obvious hypocrisy that gets harder to ignore. Model Misbehavior, the 10th episode of Season 4, which aired on December 18th, 2005, shows Lois chasing a modeling career that leads to more and more sexualized work and eventually pornographic content she originally said she found degrading. She criticizes the adult entertainment industry early in the episode before entering it herself when offered enough money and attention to override the values she said she had. Her ethical objections completely disappear the moment personal benefit shows up. Padre de Familia, the 6th episode of Season 6, which aired on November 18th, 2007, shows Lois opposing Peter's anti-immigration views and lecturing him about tolerance and liberal values, before revealing she'd hired an undocumented immigrant named Consuela as a housekeeper and took advantage of her work for years while paying below minimum wage. Her liberal politics and acting like she's morally superior didn't stop her from participating in the exact taking advantage she publicly criticized when it was convenient and saved her money. The selective morality theory doesn't claim Lois is uniquely hypocritical among TV characters, or even among Griffin family members. It claims she's built an identity as the family's ethical center, while constantly breaking that identity whenever keeping it would cost her anything meaningful. Ethics that help Lois get enforced with full authority. Ethics that would be hard for Lois get dropped without even admitting it. The household accepts this pattern because challenging Lois's authority would collapse the only system of moral order the Griffins have, no matter how fake that system might be. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the intellectual bad faith theory. Section 7. Intellectual bad faith theory. The intellectual bad faith theory takes a hard look at Brian Griffin and asks whether his smart guy act is actually real or just something he puts on to feel better than everyone else. Brian presents himself as the smartest and most cultured member of the Griffin household, and the show originally seemed to support this image before slowly tearing it apart across later seasons. This theory says that Brian uses intelligence, cultural knowledge, and liberal values mainly as tools to gain status and put himself above others, rather than because he actually cares about learning or truth. Brian doesn't chase knowledge because he genuinely wants to understand things. He chases the appearance of knowledge because it makes him feel above family members he looks down on. This matters because it reveals that the character who's supposed to be the smart, reasonable voice of the family might actually be the biggest fake of them all. The basic pattern for Brian's fake intellectualism shows up in how he talks about ideas rather than actually thinking about them throughout the series. People who are genuinely smart experience curiosity as something valuable on its own, chasing questions because the questions interest them, rather than because the chase makes them look interesting to others. Brian rarely shows this kind of real motivation. His reading habits focus on books that make him look sophisticated to people watching, rather than books that challenge or expand his thinking in real ways. He drops author names and philosophers to impress people in conversation, rather than because these sources actually shaped how he sees the world. When conversations turn to topics outside his comfort zone, Brian changes the subject or avoids it rather than admitting he doesn't know something and treating it as a chance to learn. His relationship to knowledge is basically like a trade. He puts effort into getting intellectual currency that he can spend in social situations to establish dominance over others. The payoff is status, especially status compared to Peter, whose lack of intelligence Brian mentions constantly throughout the show. Brian needs Peter to be stupid because Peter's stupidity makes Brian's intelligence meaningful by comparison. Without that contrast, Brian would have to show actual smart achievements rather than just claiming he's better than someone who can't challenge him back. Brian the Bachelor, the 7th episode of Season 4, which aired on May 15th, 2005, shows Brian's intellectual positioning through his pursuit of romantic validation through cultural signaling. The episode centers on Brian appearing on a reality dating show modeled after The Bachelorette. Brian gets picked as a contestant, and his main strategy involves setting himself apart from other guys through displays of being cultured rather than genuine connection with the woman he's supposedly trying to date. He references books and casual conversation, shows off detailed wine knowledge during group dates, and presents himself as the thinking woman's choice among regular competitors. The contrast between how Brian presents himself and what's actually driving him becomes clear as the episode goes on. He's not pursuing the Bachelorette because he finds her smart or emotionally compatible. He's pursuing her because winning would confirm his self-image as the cultured underdog who wins through better taste and class. His intellectual displays are calculated performances rather than attempts at real connection. He name-drops authors to impress rather than to share genuine enthusiasm about works that actually moved him. When he gets eliminated from the competition, Brian's reaction reveals what's really underneath his approach. He doesn't accept the outcome gracefully. He experiences it as a status injury, a rejection of the identity he built for the cameras. The main turning point in Brian's intellectual story happens in Brian Writes a Bestseller, the 6th episode of Season 9, which aired on November 21st, 2010. The episode starts with Brian finishing his long-promised novel, a serious literary work he's talked about throughout the series as proof of his artistic depth. When he sends the manuscript to publishers, expecting recognition of his talent, every single one rejects it. The literary world Brian claimed to belong to refuses to let him in. His response isn't to revise his work, improve it, or question whether it's actually good. Instead, he writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It in a single weekend, making fun of the genre while producing content for it anyway. The book becomes an instant bestseller. Brian's reaction to this success exposes the bad faith at the heart of his intellectual identity. Rather than admitting he produced cynical commercial content or feeling conflicted about abandoning his literary principles, Brian fully embraces the fame. He goes on talk shows. He becomes unbearable to his family. He treats his accidental success as proof of his importance. When Stewie confronts him on Bill Maher's show, reading passages from his original novel to show how full of himself and incompetent it actually is, Brian completely falls apart on camera. He physically attacks Stewie in front of everyone. His intellectual persona collapses the second real criticism shows up. Brian's Play, the 10th episode of Season 11, which aired on January 13th, 2013, extends this pattern into Brian's relationship with Stewie. The episode focuses on Brian writing a stage play that gets produced locally. He's incredibly proud, treating it as confirmation of his artistic worth. When Stewie reveals he's also written a play, Brian dismisses it in a condescending way as the work of a baby. He assumes his adult effort will obviously be better than anything Stewie could create. Both plays get performed at the same venue. Stewie's gets standing ovations and critical praise, while Brian's gets polite indifference at best. Brian can't accept this. Rather than acknowledging Stewie's better talent, he spirals into jealousy and bitterness. He steals Stewie's script and submits it to a Los Angeles theater under his own name. The intellectual who claims to value merit and achievement plagiarizes a baby's work because his ego can't handle being outshone. When Stewie finds out and confronts Brian, the conversation strips away whatever's left of Brian's act. Stewie tells Brian his play was insufferable, and that Brian's belief in his own talent is the most annoying thing about him. Brian eventually deletes the submission, but the damage to his intellectual credibility is permanent. The reviews from critics and fans for Brian Writes a Bestseller were very positive, with the episode getting an 8.4 rating on IMDb, one of the highest for any Brian-focused episode. Critics praised the episode for finally holding Brian accountable for years of acting like he's better than everyone. The Bill Maher sequence, where Stewie embarrasses Brian by exposing the gap between his self-image and his actual work, was widely called satisfying payoff for viewers who found Brian's superiority annoying. Online discussions often call this episode the definitive Brian takedown. Fan comments describe Brian as finally getting what he deserves, and applaud the writers for acknowledging what audiences had noticed for years. The episode marks a turning point in how Family Guy treats Brian. Earlier seasons positioned him as the voice of reason, whose intelligence looked good compared to the family's dysfunction. Brian Writes a Bestseller openly frames that intelligence as performance rather than substance. The long-term effects of Brian's fake intellectualism show up in how the series treats his act of being smart as the joke, rather than something viewers should respect. Early seasons invited viewers to laugh with Brian at the family's ignorance. Later seasons invite viewers to laugh at Brian's delusion that he's fundamentally different from them. His novels stay unpublished. His screenplays fail. His political commentary turns out to be borrowed talking points rather than original thinking. The show tears down every piece of Brian's intellectual identity, while he keeps claiming he's better than everyone. The theory says this shows something true about how intelligence can be used for social positioning rather than real understanding. Brian isn't stupid. He's capable of thinking smart when he wants to be. The problem is that his motivation is status rather than truth. He uses intellect as currency for buying social position, and when that currency gets exposed as fake, he responds with aggression rather than humility. Next up is the manufactured virtue theory. Section 8. Manufactured virtue theory. The manufactured virtue theory looks at Brian Griffin's moral positions and his displays of empathy and asks whether any of it is actually real or just another act. Brian presents himself as the liberal conscience of the Griffin household, speaking up for causes, expressing concern for groups that get pushed aside, and acting like he's morally better than the crude family members around him. This theory says these displays are planned rather than sincere. Brian takes on virtuous positions because they support his smart guy image and attract the romantic partners and social approval he wants. When holding those positions becomes hard or threatens something he cares about personally, Brian drops them without much hesitation. This matters because it reveals that Brian's ethics are just part of his look rather than what he's actually built on. He wears compassion like a costume that can come off when things change. You can see Brian's fake virtue in the gap between what he says publicly and how he acts privately throughout the series. Brian loudly supports liberal causes including environmentalism, civil rights, and social justice. He criticizes Peter's casual bigotry, makes fun of conservative viewpoints, and acts like he's more evolved than the working-class ignorance around him in Quahog. These positions aren't randomly picked. They line up perfectly with the coastal smart guy identity Brian's built for himself over years. Supporting liberal causes signals membership in a cultural class Brian desperately wants to belong to and believes he deserves to be part of. The problem is that Brian's commitment only goes as far as the social benefits these positions give him. When liberal values require real sacrifice, personal discomfort, or conflict with something he wants right now, Brian suddenly discovers flexibility he didn't know he had. His empathy turns on selectively, based on whether showing it helps him in the moment. His principles bend under pressure that someone with genuine principles would resist no matter the cost. The virtue is real enough to show publicly, but not strong enough to cost him anything he actually values. The Thin White Line, the first episode of Season 3, which aired on July 11th, 2001, sets up Brian's pattern of fake virtue through his brief career as a drug-sniffing dog for local police. The episode starts with Brian volunteering at the Quahog Police Department, where his sharp canine senses make him really good at finding drugs during searches and traffic stops. The work puts Brian in position as a community hero, serving his town in a visible and celebrated way. He gets praise from officers, media attention from local news, and the public admiration he constantly wants but rarely earns through his creative work. Brian fully embraces the role, enjoying the recognition of his contribution to society and public safety. The virtue is visible and celebrated by authority figures, which is exactly the kind of virtue Brian values most. The problem shows up when Brian starts using the cocaine he's supposed to be finding. His repeated exposure to drugs during searches leads to addiction that develops fast. The community hero becomes a user himself, snorting the evidence he was trusted to identify. Brian's fall is rapid and complete once it starts. He shows up to family events visibly high and unable to hide it. His behavior becomes wild, unreliable, and dangerous to those around him. The dog who positioned himself as serving the community is now stealing from it to feed his habit. When family members confront him about his addiction after noticing the change, Brian first denies the problem exists before eventually going to rehab. The episode frames his recovery as genuine growth, but what's underneath is troubling. Brian's virtue lasted exactly as long as it was convenient and personally rewarding, then fell apart the moment real temptation showed up in front of him. The clearest example of manufactured virtue happens in The D in Apartment 23, the 6th episode of Season 14, which aired on November 8th, 2015. The episode centers on Brian moving into an apartment building where he becomes romantically interested in an attractive neighbor named Ida. To impress her, Brian plays up his liberal values and emotional sensitivity in every interaction they have. He presents himself as the thoughtful, emotionally available man she's been looking for after disappointing experiences with less enlightened guys. He signals his acceptance of diversity and his rejection of bigotry at every opportunity. The relationship builds entirely on this presentation of Brian as an evolved, accepting partner who's different from other men. When Brian finds out his new girlfriend is transgender, his reaction completely exposes the limits of his fake virtue. Despite years of acting like he's an ally to groups that get pushed aside and criticizing others for their bigotry, Brian vomits when he learns the truth about her identity. His physical disgust goes against every liberal position he's ever claimed to hold. He doesn't respond with the acceptance his stated values should demand from him. He responds with gut-level disgust that reveals those values as performance rather than real belief. The episode caused major controversy for how it portrayed transgender identity and used Brian's disgust as a comedy moment. But the character reveal underneath fits perfectly with Brian's established pattern across earlier seasons. His liberalism is social currency he spends to get status and romantic partners, rather than genuine belief he holds, no matter what. When tested by actual contact with the people he claims to support, Brian fails instantly and physically. The vomiting isn't a thoughtful reconsideration of his attraction. It's an automatic physical reaction that bypasses his carefully built liberal identity completely and shows what's really underneath. The reviews from critics and audiences for The D in Apartment 23 were intensely negative, with the episode getting widespread criticism for being hateful toward transgender people and insensitive toward a vulnerable community. GLAAD formally condemned the episode and called for accountability from the show. Many critics called it one of Family Guy's worst moments in a series full of controversial episodes. The episode has a 5.8 rating on IMDb, way below series average, with user reviews expressing anger at how it handled the subject. However, defenders argued it accurately showed Brian's hypocrisy, rather than saying hatred of trans people is acceptable. The vomit gag was meant to expose Brian's failure, not support it. Brian's disgust reveals the emptiness underneath his liberal performance in a way that can't be explained away. He talks constantly about acceptance while being completely incapable of practicing it when the situation actually requires follow-through. The controversy overshadowed this character point in public discussion, but the reveal about Brian's fake virtue fits with years of established behavior. You can see the long-term effects of Brian's fake virtue and how the series treats his moral statements with more and more doubt as seasons go on. Early Brian could lecture Peter about tolerance, and the story would support his position as the reasonable voice. Later Brian delivers the same lectures, while the show at the same time shows proof of his hypocrisy that viewers are supposed to catch. His loud support for causes becomes a running joke rather than a character trait to respect. His empathy turns out to be highly selective, turning on for attractive women and turning off for anyone who can't benefit him socially or romantically. The show originally presented his ethics as genuine, before slowly revealing them as costume worn for social advantage. Brian cares a lot about appearing virtuous to people who might reward him. He cares very little about actually being virtuous when nobody's watching, or when virtue requires giving something up. The virtue was always fake and made for public consumption. The show just got more honest about showing where it was made. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the self-destructive desire theory. Section 9. Self-destructive desire theory. The self-destructive desire theory looks at Brian Griffin's pattern of chasing things that are guaranteed to fail, and asks whether this pattern might actually be on purpose at some level. Brian doesn't just have bad luck in romance or his career despite trying hard. He always picks partners who are unavailable, totally wrong for him, or certain to reject him for reasons he could see coming if he wanted to. He puts energy into creative projects that can't succeed given his actual talent level and his refusal to accept feedback. He picks up habits that destroy the stability he claims to want. This theory says the pattern isn't an accident, but actually serves a purpose for him. Brian gets something from failure that success wouldn't give him. Whether that's proving his victim story right, avoiding real closeness with people, or escaping from finding out that getting what he wants wouldn't actually make him happy. You can see Brian's self-destructive pattern in how he keeps picking romantic partners who can't return his feelings in any lasting way. Brian keeps going after women who are married, engaged, emotionally unavailable, or totally wrong for his lifestyle and the fact that he's a dog. His attraction to Lois is the clearest and most persistent example of this. She's his best friend's wife, mother to kids he lives with daily, and completely unavailable for the romantic relationship Brian fantasizes about. Going after Lois guarantees failure before he even starts. The attraction can't be acted on without destroying the household that gives Brian shelter, food, companionship, and the closest thing to family he has. Yet Brian returns to this attraction over and over across multiple seasons despite knowing for certain it can never work out. The pattern goes way beyond Lois, to basically every woman Brian pursues seriously. He goes after complications and obstacles like they're features rather than problems. Simple, available women who might actually want him hold no appeal for Brian. He needs the drama of wanting someone he can't have, because actually getting success would force him to face whether he's actually capable of keeping a healthy relationship. The self-destruction protects him in a twisted way. By picking partners who will definitely reject him, Brian avoids finding out whether the problem is his situation or just him. Brian in Love. The 4th episode of Season 2, which aired on March 7th, 2000, sets up the self-destructive pattern through Brian realizing his romantic feelings for Lois. The episode starts with Brian having mysterious urination episodes throughout the Griffin house that he can't explain or control. He goes to therapy to understand the behavior, first thinking it's anxiety or territorial instinct expressing itself in weird ways. Through multiple sessions with his therapist, Brian uncovers the disturbing truth underneath his symptoms. He's in love with Lois. The urination represents misplaced anxiety about powerful feelings he can't express or act on without destroying everything he depends on. The reveal is played for emotional weight rather than easy comedy. Brian genuinely struggles with discovering that he loves someone he can never have. Someone who belongs to his best friend and roommate. The therapist encourages Brian to express his feelings directly, thinking that honest confession will give him closure and let him move forward. Brian follows this advice despite knowing exactly how it will end, and tells Lois he loves her. Lois responds with genuine compassion but absolutely clear rejection. She values Brian as a friend and family member, but has zero romantic interest in him. Brian accepts this outcome, and the episode ends with apparent resolution.
But the self-destructive pattern is already visible if you look closely.
Brian's mind didn't randomly pick Lois as a love interest from all available options. It picked the one woman in his daily life whose acceptance would be most impossible and whose rejection was most certain from the very beginning. His own brain set up a situation designed to produce suffering rather than connection.
The main event in Brian's self-destructive pattern happens across Brian Griffin's House of Pain, the 15th episode of Season 8, which aired on May 2nd, 2010.
The episode follows Brian's attempt to develop a TV pilot based on his creative vision and prove himself as a writer once and for all. Brian writes a thoughtful, artistic script exploring serious themes about relationships and human connection. He believes this project will finally confirm his creative ambitions and prove he's more than the failed novelist the family dismisses him as. When James Woods gets involved and steals Brian's script, producing it as a crude comedy called Class Holes, Brian's artistic vision gets gutted and replaced with entertainment he considers beneath him. The show becomes a massive hit in its ruined form, earning ratings Brian's original vision would never have gotten. Brian gets no credit and no money for his stolen work. His creative effort succeeds only after being transformed into something he finds disgusting. The self-destructive element shows up in how Brian set himself up for this outcome through choices he made freely. He trusted James Woods, a guy known for being untrustworthy with documented history of wild behavior throughout the series. He failed to protect his work legally before sharing it. He put the opportunity over protecting himself from obvious risks that anyone could have seen coming. The pattern suggests Brian arranged for his project to be stolen and corrupted without realizing he was doing it. Success on his own terms would have required him to deliver more success afterward and face real expectations. Failure caused by betrayal lets Brian stay a victim of circumstances rather than facing his own limitations. Brian the Closer, the 4th episode of Season 13, which aired on November 9th, 2014, extends the pattern into Brian's professional life and shows how success itself triggers his need to crash and burn. The episode shows Brian taking a job as a real estate agent after his writing career completely stalls. He discovers unexpected talent for sales, using his charm and verbal skills to close deals and earn big commissions. For maybe the first time in the series, Brian gets genuine professional success through his own abilities without anyone handing it to him. The money flows in steadily. His confidence grows with each closing. He appears to have found a career path that actually works for him. Then, Brian starts selling haunted and messed up properties, deliberately hiding problems to get bigger commissions. His real success corrupts immediately into fraud that will definitely be discovered eventually. When buyers realize what Brian sold them, he loses everything he built. His career collapses. His reputation is destroyed. The self-destructive pattern is obvious and impossible to miss in this episode. Brian had real success right in front of him and destroyed it through choices he didn't need to make. He could have kept selling properties, honestly, and built something real. He chose fraud because success without self-destruction felt wrong or unfamiliar somehow. The collapse put Brian back in his natural state of failure and victimhood, where he seems most comfortable. The reviews from critics and audiences for Brian Griffin's House of Pain were generally positive, with the episode getting a 7.5 rating on IMDb and praise from reviewers. Critics appreciated the commentary on TV production, network interference, and the creative compromises writers have to make. The James Woods performance was called particularly effective. The episode works as industry satire while revealing Brian's self-defeating tendencies at the same time. Fan discussions often focus on whether Brian deserved better treatment or whether his naivety justified what happened to him. The division mirrors the uncertainty the episode creates around Brian's responsibility for his own failure. He's genuinely victimized by James Woods in ways that deserve sympathy. He's also genuinely responsible for creating the conditions for that victimization through choices he made freely with open eyes. You can see the long-term effects of Brian's self-destructive desires in how his story arc keeps repeating across seasons without ever really changing. He never learns from failure because failure serves a purpose he's not willing to give up. Each collapsed relationship and failed project confirms his story that the world doesn't appreciate him, rather than forcing him to look at his own role in setting up these outcomes. Lois stays his impossible love interest despite multiple rejections. His novels stay unpublished, despite feedback that could improve them.
His relationships end in predictable patterns he refuses to change. The theory says Brian isn't unlucky in any real sense. He's committed to a cycle of wanting, failing, and suffering that gives meaning his actual achievements never could. Success would require Brian to become someone capable of keeping success over time. Failure lets him stay Brian, the romantic sufferer whose potential is always frustrated by circumstances beyond his control. The desire for destruction protects him from the terrifying possibility that his potential was always fake. Next up is the Chaos Incentive Theory. Section 10. Chaos Incentive Theory. The Chaos Incentive Theory takes a close look at Peter Griffin and asks whether his constant destruction is really just stupidity or something more on purpose. This theory says Peter doesn't just cause chaos through being dumb or impulsive. He actually makes minor problems way bigger and turns them into disasters because chaos gives him the attention and control he can't get through normal means. Peter sits in a weird position in his household and community. He's supposed to be the head of the family, but nobody actually respects him or his opinions. He has a job, but shows no skill that would get him promoted. He has friends, but relates to them mainly through shared problems rather than anything healthy. Chaos becomes Peter's way of mattering in the world. When he turns a small issue into a huge disaster, he becomes the center of attention. Everyone has to respond to Peter. Everyone has to deal with what Peter created. This matters because the pattern isn't an accident, but gets rewarded by the social attention chaos brings him that ordinary behavior never could. Understanding Peter's chaos incentive requires looking at what he gains from the disasters he creates versus what he would gain from preventing them. A normal adult who notices a minor problem handles it quietly and gets barely any credit for the prevention. The crisis that never happens creates no drama, no attention, and no story. Peter has learned, maybe without even knowing it, that creating or making crises bigger puts him at the center of stories he would otherwise barely be part of. When Peter causes a disaster, Lois has to pay intense attention to him, even if that attention is negative and angry. His kids have to respond to circumstances he created. His friends become participants in adventures that wouldn't exist without him starting them. The chaos isn't a mistake in Peter's personality. It's something that serves his need to feel important. He can't earn attention through achievement, wisdom, or reliability because he doesn't have the capacity to consistently be good at any of those things. He can always earn attention through destruction, and destruction requires no special skill beyond willingness to act without thinking about consequences. Death Has a Shadow, the very first episode of Season 1, which aired on January 31st, 1999, establishes the chaos incentive pattern right from the show's beginning. The episode starts with Peter getting fired from the happy-go-lucky toy factory after he falls asleep at work because he went to a stag party the night before. This is a problem that could be handled easily, that most adults could deal with. Peter could tell Lois he lost his job, they could adjust their spending, and he could look for new work. Instead, Peter chooses to hide his firing from Lois and collect welfare checks to replace his income. The hiding turns a simple job setback into a big, complicated lie that requires constant upkeep and lying. Peter gets a welfare check way larger than his actual salary because of a mistake. Rather than reporting the error like an honest person, he spends the money wildly, buying gifts for the family and enjoying a lifestyle his real income never supported. The chaos gets bigger with each decision Peter makes. He could stop at any point and face relatively smaller consequences that would be easier to handle than what's coming. He chooses instead to make the problem bigger, because each time he does this, it extends the period during which he's at the center of his own drama. When the fraud eventually gets discovered, Peter has to go to court. He becomes the subject of media attention. The entire town becomes aware of Peter Griffin and his situation. The chaos turned Peter from an ordinary factory worker into someone whose choices demanded public attention and official response. The clearest example of chaos incentive happens in PTV, the 14th episode of Season 4, which aired on November 6, 2005. The episode starts with the FCC increasing broadcast censorship after an incident at the Emmy Awards. Peter's favorite shows become unwatchable because of content restrictions. This is an annoyance, not a crisis. A reasonable person might complain, change what they watch, or write letters to networks expressing frustration. Peter instead creates his own television station called PTV, broadcasting from the Griffin home.
He produces uncensored content, including vulgar programming that pushes every possible boundary, just because he can. The FCC responds by sending agents to censor Peter's station specifically. When Peter refuses to comply, the FCC chairman extends censorship to real life itself, sending out agents to censor the Griffin family's actual speech and behavior in their own home. The chaos Peter created over TV content has now turned into government agents literally following his family around and bleeping their conversations in real time. Peter's initial complaint about television edits has turned into a government crisis involving personal liberty and government overreach that affects everyone around him. He organizes a protest and rally. He becomes the face of an anti-censorship movement. He speaks before Congress about the issue. A man who is annoyed by TV edits has turned himself into a political figure whose choices affect national policy. The episode ends with a compromise that restores some freedoms while keeping content ratings. Peter has achieved nothing practical that he couldn't have achieved by just watching different shows in the first place. But he has positioned himself at the center of a national controversy, commanded the attention of federal agencies, and forced everyone around him to deal with circumstances he created out of nothing. And then there were fewer. The season premiere of Season 9, which aired on September 26, 2010, extends the chaos incentive into how Peter affects others and shows how his presence turns contained situations into disasters. The episode is a murder mystery where the main Family Guy characters get invited to James Woods' mansion for a dinner party that turns into a killing spree. Peter doesn't commit the murders himself, but his behavior throughout the episode makes tensions worse, destroys evidence, and prevents rational problem solving that might identify the killer sooner and save lives. When characters try to investigate carefully, Peter interrupts with irrelevant observations or destructive actions that derail everything. When the group tries to stay calm and think clearly, Peter's panic spreads to everyone else and makes things worse. His chaos is contagious in any group setting. The episode shows that Peter doesn't need to intentionally create disaster. His mere presence in a crisis situation guarantees that the crisis will get worse, because he can't resist actions that create drama around himself. The murder mystery format requires characters to behave intelligently to solve the puzzle. Peter's chaos incentive works against intelligence at every single turn. Not because he wants people to die, but because calm, step-by-step solving would minimize his role in what's happening. The reviews from critics and audiences for PTV were extremely positive, with the episode getting an 8.5 rating on IMDb, one of the highest in the entire series. Critics praised the episode's way of making fun of things and musical numbers, especially the song about FCC censorship that became a fan favorite and got shared widely online. The episode won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics, one of the show's biggest honors. But the episode's popularity hides the character reveal at its center. Peter didn't create PTV because he genuinely cared about free speech or artistic expression as principles worth defending. He created it because he was bored and irritated, and making things bigger gave him something interesting to do while making him feel important. The chaos incentive shows in how Peter responds to each time things get worse, not with attempts to calm things down, but with more provocations that guarantee continued attention on him. You can see the long-term effects of Peter's chaos incentive and how Quahog has adapted to expect disaster whenever Peter gets involved in any situation. His friends include him in activities, knowing destruction is likely to follow. His family plans around his capacity for making things worse rather than trying to stop it. The town has rebuilt structures Peter destroyed, replaced officials Peter displaced, and recovered from crises Peter created so many times that his chaos has become part of how the community operates day to day. The theory says this acceptance helps rather than stops Peter's behavior. He faces no lasting consequences for the disasters he creates, because everyone has learned to treat Peter-generated chaos as weather rather than choice, something that just happens, rather than something someone decided to do. The reward system stays intact. Peter can always gain attention, significance, and being at the center of the story by turning minor problems into major disasters. And nothing in his world discourages him from continuing to do exactly that. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the reversed empathy theory. Section 11, Reversed Empathy Theory. The reversed empathy theory looks at Peter Griffin's emotional responses and finds something genuinely disturbing underneath the comedy. This theory says that Peter experiences empathy in a flipped way, where watching other people get hurt makes him feel good instead of bad, and his enjoyment actually increases the worse the suffering gets.
Normal empathy means feeling connected to what other people are going through in a way that makes you want to help, or at least stop causing more pain.
When a typical person sees someone hurting, they feel uncomfortable and want to do something about it.
Peter's empathy seems to work in reverse.
When he sees someone in pain, he feels something closer to satisfaction or entertainment that makes him want to keep doing whatever caused the pain.
This matters because it explains patterns in Peter's behavior that simple stupidity can't account for. He doesn't just fail to see that his actions will hurt people. He often seems to recognize the harm coming ahead of time and goes forward specifically because the harm is the point.
You can see reversed empathy in how Peter responds to suffering throughout the series compared to how other characters respond to the exact same situations. When Chris struggles socially, Lois shows concern and tries to help him get through it. When Meg faces rejection, even Brian occasionally offers comfort, despite how self-absorbed he usually is. When Stewie faces setbacks, his anger goes outward rather than being satisfied by other people's pain.
Peter alone always responds to family members' suffering with not caring at best and actually enjoying it at worst. His treatment of Meg is the clearest and most persistent example of this pattern. Peter doesn't simply neglect Meg or fail to notice her pain because he's distracted by something else. He creates situations designed to embarrass her, laughs at her suffering when it happens, whether he caused it or not, and shows zero discomfort at watching his own daughter in distress. The contrast with how he treats Chris is especially telling. While Peter isn't a great father to either child, his cruelty toward Meg has a more focused quality that his treatment of Chris lacks entirely. This pattern goes way beyond Meg to basically everyone Peter runs into in his daily life. He finds physical injury funny, regardless of who gets hurt or how bad the damage is. He finds emotional devastation entertaining when he sees it happening to others. The reversal isn't selective or based on his relationship with the person. It seems to be Peter's basic emotional response to human suffering in all its forms, whether that suffering happens to strangers, friends, or his own family member. Road to Rupert, the 9th episode of Season 5, which aired on January 28, 2007, shows Peter's reversed empathy through how he treats others when given tasks that require care or consideration. The episode's Peter subplot involves him competing in a skiing competition after trading Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert for a surfboard without permission or any concern for his son's deep emotional attachment to the toy. Peter knew how much Rupert meant to Stewie. He made the trade anyway, because Stewie's feelings simply didn't count as something worth considering. The broader pattern shows up in how Peter treats anyone put in his care throughout the entire series. When given responsibility for living things, Peter responds with neglect that's basically cruelty on purpose rather than simple carelessness. When asked to think about other people's feelings before acting, Peter treats the request as some impossible burden rather than a normal social expectation that most people handle automatically. The episode shows Peter's total inability to process other people's needs as real reasons to change how he acts. His reversed empathy means that knowing about someone else's needs doesn't make him want to help them. Instead, it creates irritation at being asked to care about something that gives him no entertainment value, or worse, active interest in taking advantage of that vulnerability for his own amusement. Other characters' needs are obstacles to Peter's enjoyment, rather than opportunities for connection or helping. This isn't how normal people experience the world around them. Most people feel at least some pull toward helping others when they're aware of suffering. Peter feels the opposite pull, toward continuing or increasing whatever is causing the pain. The clearest example of reversed empathy in its most disturbing form happens across Lottery Fever, the season premiere of Season 10, which aired on October 2nd, 2011. The episode starts with Peter winning the lottery and suddenly having enormous wealth that completely transforms his circumstances. A person with normal empathy who got unexpected fortune might feel grateful, generous, or worried about how money affects relationships. Peter immediately becomes cruel to everyone around him in ways that show reversed empathy, clearly and without any doubt. He doesn't just become careless with money or make foolish purchases like you might expect from someone suddenly rich. He uses his wealth to embarrass people who previously treated him as equals and friends, taking pleasure in their discomfort in ways that go far beyond thoughtlessness. He hires his friends Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire as servants and constantly degrades them for his own entertainment. He orders them to perform demeaning tasks while laughing openly at their visible discomfort and embarrassment.
enjoying every moment of their humiliation. He treats Lois like property rather than a partner who deserves respect after years of marriage. He ignores his kids, except when acknowledging them gives him a chance for mockery that entertains him at their expense. The wealth removes limits that previously held back how Peter could express his reversed empathy. When he was poor, he depended on other people and needed to maintain some basic working level in relationships to survive day to day. Wealth gets rid of this depending on people and reveals what Peter actually wants from social interaction: the opportunity to enjoy other people's suffering without facing any consequences for it. When the family loses everything and becomes poor again, Peter expresses relief that he can go back to being friends with people he was actively abusing just days earlier. He shows no guilt about his behavior and no recognition that he caused genuine harm to people who cared about him and had been loyal friends for years. His friends forgive him because the show needs to reset to normal, but the episode has revealed something about Peter that can't be unseen once you notice it. Brian and Stewie, the 17th episode of Season 8, which aired on May 2nd, 2010, provides contrast that helps us understand Peter's reversed empathy by showing what normal empathy looks like between Family Guy characters when they're actually capable of it. The bottle episode features only Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault, having genuine emotional conversation about mortality, purpose, and their relationship with each other. The episode proves that Family Guy characters can show real empathy and emotional connection when the story allows it. Brian expresses genuine care about Stewie's well-being that goes beyond their usual dynamic. Stewie reveals vulnerability he normally hides behind aggression and acting superior. The episode stands out precisely because it's so dramatically different from typical Family Guy interaction patterns, especially those involving Peter. Peter never has conversations like the one Brian and Stewie share in the vault. He never shows the capacity for emotional connection they display. The contrast helps us understand his character. Brian and Stewie prove that empathy exists within the Family Guy universe as an available trait that characters can have. Peter's absence of it therefore represents something specific about his character rather than a limitation of the show's genre or comedy style. The reviews from critics and audiences for Lottery Fever were mixed, with the episode getting a 7.3 rating on IMDb and reviews noting the unusual darkness of Peter's behavior when given wealth and power. Some critics found the cruelty excessive, even by Family Guy standards, which is saying something given the show's history of pushing boundaries. Fan discussions frequently point to this episode as evidence that Peter is genuinely mean, rather than just stupid or thoughtless like he's sometimes portrayed. The episode forces viewers to confront whether Peter's harmful behavior represents accidental consequences of low intelligence, or intentional choices by someone who enjoys causing pain and seeks out opportunities to do it. The reversed empathy theory says the second interpretation fits the piled-up evidence much better when you look at the full picture. Peter doesn't accidentally harm people and then feel bad about it when he sees the results of what he's done. He deliberately harms people and feels good about it, regardless of the damage he causes to their lives and well-being. The lottery wealth simply turned up a pattern that was always there, but previously held back by circumstances and social pressure that forced him to tone down his cruelest impulses to maintain necessary relationships he depended on. You can see the long-term effects of Peter's reversed empathy and how the show has made his cruelty worse across seasons, without really changing his position in the household or community. Early Peter was insensitive and foolish in ways that caused harm through carelessness and not thinking things through. Later, Peter is actively mean in ways the show acknowledges through other characters' reactions, but never meaningfully addresses through lasting consequences that might change his behavior or make him face what he's done. Meg's abuse has gotten worse, from neglect to active persecution and violence that gets worse with each passing season. Peter's treatment of his friends has grown from thoughtlessness to intentional embarrassment designed to hurt them. His disregard for Lois has expanded from inattention to deliberate cruelty that shows no respect for their marriage. The reversed empathy theory says this getting worse reflects the writers exploring what happens when you follow through on how Peter's emotions actually work. If Peter genuinely finds suffering entertaining, his behavior will naturally become more extreme as he looks for stronger versions of the thing he enjoys. The character has no way to stop himself from being cruel, because cruelty feels good to him. Only outside limits stop his behavior, and the show has slowly removed those limits to generate more extreme comedy at other characters' expense. Up next is the institutional disruption theory. Section 12. Institutional disruption theory. The institutional disruption theory looks at what happens whenever Peter Griffin gets put into any organized system, and the results are always a disaster in ways that go beyond just not being good at things. This theory says Peter works like a wrecking ball in any structured environment, whether that's a workplace, government, religious place, or community group. Peter doesn't just fail to meet expectations because he can't do it. He actively tears apart the systems that try to include him, leaving chaos where order used to be. The pattern shows up way too much, across way too many different situations, to be coincidence or bad luck. Schools, businesses, churches, community groups, and government all fall apart fast when Peter gets involved with them. This matters because the theory says Peter has something in him that just doesn't work with how groups operate. When he shows up, he brings disorder into systems that are specifically built to keep things organized. Understanding how Peter wrecks things requires looking at his relationship to authority, rules, and group effort throughout the series. Peter doesn't think that systems limiting his behavior or making him put aside what he wants for the group's goals are actually fair or make sense. When a workplace requires showing up on time, Peter thinks that's random, unfair treatment, rather than a reasonable expectation that applies to everyone equally. When a church asks for respect, Peter treats the request like some impossible demand that he fake feeling something he doesn't actually feel. When government creates regulations, Peter sees those regulations as personal attacks on his freedom, rather than group agreements that let society work for everyone's benefit. This attitude toward institutions as obstacles, rather than helpful structures, means Peter can't be part of them in any useful way, no matter how hard he might try. He doesn't see himself as part of systems bigger than himself that do important things. He sees systems as things happening to him, things forced on him from outside that deserve pushback rather than cooperation or actually trying to work with them. The chaos he causes makes sense when you think about how he sees things. You can't help out with something you see as enemy territory trying to control you. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns. The 18th episode of Season 4, which aired on December 18th, 2005, shows how Peter wrecks things through his relationship with organized religion. The episode starts with Francis Griffin, Peter's super Catholic father, showing up to make sure that Stewie gets baptized in the Catholic Church, like family tradition says. Peter's complicated history with Catholicism comes out throughout Francis's visit. Peter experienced Catholic education as traumatic and controlling when he was growing up. He connects the church with guilt, punishment, and random rules put in place by people in charge who claimed God supported whatever they wanted to enforce. When Francis insists on the baptism happening, Peter rebels by starting his own religion based on worshiping Arthur Fonzarelli from Happy Days. The Church of the Fawns isn't a serious attempt at theology or spiritual guidance. It's Peter's way of messing with an institution he hates by creating a joke version that mocks its claims to authority over people's lives. Peter recruits followers from around Quahog. He builds a congregation of people looking for alternatives. He creates rituals based on Fonzie's catchphrases and leather jacket look that people actually show up for. The religion grows fast because other Quahog residents apparently share Peter's desire for spiritual experience without the demands of traditional religious participation that requires actual sacrifice and commitment. The Catholic Church responds by sending representatives to check out this competing faith that's pulling potential members away from established religion and threatening their position in the community. The big moment happens when Peter's Church of the Fawns gets enough attention to get a response from both the Catholic Church and the broader Quahog community. Francis Griffin is horrified that his son has started what he sees as a fake religion, and doubles down on his efforts to bring Peter back to Catholicism through guilt, manipulation, and direct confrontation about faith and family obligation. The Catholic representatives who check out the Church of the Fawns treat it as a genuine threat to their interests, rather than the obvious joke it appears to be from the outside. Peter's joke religion has messed up the religious landscape of Quahog just by existing and offering people an alternative to traditional options that require more from them in terms of moral behavior and commitment. The episode explores whether the Church of the Fawns actually gives real spiritual value to its members, or just lets them avoid the serious commitments traditional religion requires. Peter's congregation includes people looking for community, meaning, and ritual, without the moral demands that come with established faiths that have centuries of tradition behind them. The chaos Peter causes isn't totally negative from their perspective. He's created space for religious expression that didn't exist before, even if that space is built on television nostalgia rather than anything deeper or more meaningful about faith. The episode ends with Peter partially making up with Francis and Catholic tradition, But the Church of the Fawns keeps existing after the credits roll. Peter has permanently changed Quahog's religious landscape through his inability to just be part of existing institutions without transforming or fighting against them at every opportunity. The Griffin Family History, the 27th episode of Season 4, which aired on May 14, 2006, extends how Peter wrecks things across generations by revealing that Griffins have been messing up institutions throughout American history for centuries. The episode frames Peter's tendency to wreck things as something passed down through his family, rather than just his individual problem, suggesting the pattern started long before Peter was even born. Through flashback sequences, the episode shows Griffin ancestors messing up the Mayflower voyage, undermining the American Revolution, and causing chaos in various historical contexts where institutions tried to work around them. Peter's great-great-grandfather, Josiah Griffin, appears on the Mayflower acting basically identical to modern Peter, causing problems through the same combo of stupidity, selfishness, and inability to work with the group that defines Peter today. The episode suggests Peter's tendency to wreck things isn't a personal failing that could be fixed with education or therapy, but a family trait handed down through generations of Griffins. Wherever Griffins show up in history, institutions suffer because they're there. The historical framing turns Peter's tendency to wreck things from an individual problem into something almost huge in scope that goes beyond any single person or time period. The Griffins are agents of chaos, whose presence in any organized human effort guarantees that effort will be complicated by them being there in ways nobody could have predicted or prepared for ahead of time. The episode got mixed reviews from critics, with some reviewers praising the ambitious historical scope and creative flashback structure, while others found it repetitive and not as funny as it could have been. The episode has a 7.4 rating on IMDb. Decent, but not exceptional for the series. However, what the episode contributes to understanding how Peter wrecks things is big, regardless of how entertaining people found it as comedy. By establishing that Griffin ancestors behaved identically to Peter across centuries of American history, the episode suggests the wrecking is fundamental to who Griffins are, rather than something based on their situation or something that could be addressed. Peter doesn't wreck institutions because of his specific upbringing, education, or life experiences that shaped him. He wrecks institutions because that's what Griffins do and have always done throughout recorded history. The family trait framing removes individual responsibility, while at the same time confirming that Peter's effect on organizations is predictable and consistent, no matter what the organization is actually trying to do. You can see the long-term effects of how Peter wrecks things and how Quahog's various organizations have adapted to him being around over the series run. The Pawtucket Brewery keeps employing Peter despite his consistent failure to do his job well or contribute anything useful that would justify his salary. The explanation can't be that Peter provides value, because he clearly doesn't by any reasonable measure. The explanation has to be that the brewery has absorbed his chaos as normal operating cost that they've learned to live with over time. Similarly, community groups, churches, schools, and government bodies in Quahog have learned to expect Peter-generated chaos and plan around it, rather than trying to prevent it from happening in the first place. The theory says this acceptance represents the organizations basically giving up, rather than bouncing back or adapting in healthy ways. Organizations that accept Peter's chaos as something that's just going to happen have essentially given up their capacity to work as organizations in any real sense. They continue existing in formal terms, while abandoning the actual purposes organizations are supposed to serve for their communities. Peter hasn't just wrecked individual institutions over the years. He has wrecked the whole concept of how institutions work for everyone around him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the Contained Transgression Theory. Section 13, Contained Transgression Theory. The Contained Transgression Theory takes a closer look at Chris Griffin and finds something surprising hiding underneath his dumb, harmless exterior. This theory says that Chris actually has the highest raw potential for harmful behavior among all the Griffin family members, but he keeps this potential locked up through narrow, controlled ways that stop it from becoming full-scale disaster. Chris shows he's capable of violence, aggression, and really messed up behavior that goes beyond what any other family member shows when you really pay attention. But these abilities stay mostly locked up within specific situations that limit how they get shown and stop them from growing into the big destruction Peter regularly causes. This matters because it suggests Chris's harmlessness isn't because the danger isn't there, but because the danger Danger gets successfully locked up through circumstances rather than who he is as a person. To understand where Chris's locked up bad side comes from, you have to look at his position within the Griffin family and where he sits in Quahog socially. Chris fills the role of the dim, harmless son whose limitations make him easy to overlook and ignore. He doesn't have Peter's social connections and community presence that would make harmful behavior spread further. He doesn't have Stewie's super genius intelligence that would allow for careful planning of schemes. He doesn't have Brian's way with words that would give him cover for manipulating others. Chris appears to be the family member least capable of causing real harm because he doesn't have the tools and opportunities that make harmful action possible on a big scale. This theory challenges this view by pointing to moments throughout the series when Chris displays abilities that completely don't match his harmless image. He shows physical strength and willingness to use violence that go beyond any other family member. He displays intense urges that are disturbing in their strength. He shows ability for cruelty that comes out suddenly and without warning. These moments suggest Chris's harmlessness is an act or lucky situation rather than who he really is deep down. The danger is there, but locked up by factors that might not last forever. The Fat Guy Strangler. The 17th episode of Season 4, which aired on November 27th, 2005, sets up the family background for Chris's locked up bad side through the reveal of Patrick Pewterschmidt, Lois's brother, who was locked up in a mental hospital that nobody in the family knew about. The episode starts when Lois discovers she has a brother she never knew existed because her parents hid his existence from everyone. Patrick was sent to the Brookfield Institution after showing violent behavior as a child that scared his family. When Lois arranges for Patrick's release, believing he's been fixed after all these years, Patrick begins murdering fat men throughout Quahog in a killing spree. The killings get triggered by Patrick's traumatic childhood memory of witnessing his mother having an affair with Jackie Gleason, which created a connection in his mind between overweight men and violation that Patrick deals with through killing innocent people. The episode reveals that severe mental illness and capacity for violence exist within the Pewterschmidt genetic line that produced Lois, and by extension, her children, including Chris. Chris carries genes from a family that produces locked-up killers capable of serial murder when triggered by the right circumstances. The episode doesn't directly say Chris will become a murderer, but it establishes that the raw material for such an outcome exists within his family genes and could come out under the right conditions. The big moment showing Chris's locked-up bad side happens across multiple episodes that reveal disturbing abilities beneath his harmless surface when you look closely at his behavior. To Love and Die in Dixie, the 12th episode of Season 3, which aired on November 15th, 2001, places Chris in the Federal Witness Protection Program after he witnesses a robbery and can identify the criminal to police. The family move to the Deep South, where Chris takes on a new identity to stay safe. During this move, Chris shows he can adapt to violent circumstances in a way that suggests he's comfortable with danger going beyond normal teenage experience. More importantly, Chris develops a romantic relationship with a local teenager named Sam, who turns out to be a boy in disguise, hiding his true identity. Chris's response when he discovers Sam's actual gender reveals his capacity for intense emotional reaction that almost becomes violence before turning into confused acceptance of the situation. The episode shows Chris handling criminal danger, gender confusion, and family upheaval with a strange calm that suggests either really good resilience or concerning disconnection from normal emotional responses that most people would have. Steroids, the 13th episode of Season 7, which aired on April 26, 2009, shows a mean side of Chris that comes out when he gets a chance to pick on someone smaller. In this episode, Stewie gets popular at school because a bigger kid starts protecting him. Chris gets jealous and starts bullying Stewie pretty badly. This isn't just normal brother stuff where siblings mess with each other. Chris actually seems to enjoy making Stewie feel bad, which is a lot like how Peter enjoys watching other people suffer that we talked about earlier. It's like Chris picked up that same trait from his dad. When Chris gets a chance to push someone around, his usual harmless act disappears really fast. The Fat Guy Strangler adds another layer to this. That episode shows us that Lois's side of the family has serious mental health issues. Her brother Patrick spent decades in a mental hospital before becoming a serial killer. Chris has genes from that same family line. The show never says whether Chris got any of Patrick's problems, but it makes you wonder. If Patrick seemed normal enough to get released from the hospital before he started killing people, What might be hiding inside Chris that just hasn't come out yet? The fan response to these episodes mostly focused on the comedy rather than what they tell us about Chris. To Love and Die in Dixie got good reviews for its southern jokes and the Sam storyline, sitting at a 7.8 on IMDb. Steroids got more mixed reactions, with a 7.2 rating, and some viewers said the bullying scenes made them uncomfortable. The Fat Guy Strangler has a 7.6 rating, and most people remember it for introducing Patrick Pewterschmidt into the show. But here's what most viewers miss when watching these episodes. When you put them all together, they paint a picture of Chris as someone whose darker side is being held back rather than not existing at all. Each episode shows us another piece of what Chris could be capable of if nothing was stopping him. The violence is there under the surface. The intensity is there. The cruelty shows up when the situation allows it. And the family connection through genes to the Pewterschmidt family's mental health issues is there in his blood. You can see the long-term effects of Chris's locked-up bad side and how the show treats him without ever really dealing with the disturbing stuff various episodes have shown us. Chris stays the harmless, dumb son in the show's setup, even though we keep getting hints that this picture of him isn't complete and might even be dangerous to believe. The evil monkey in his closet, which showed up throughout early seasons as something Chris was scared of, turned out to be harmless and friendly when we finally learned the truth. You could see this as the show stepping back from darker ideas about Chris by giving us innocent explanations for his fears. But this theory suggests something else. The evil monkey was never what was really bothering Chris in the first place. The real thing that's disturbing was always inside Chris himself, and the monkey just gave everyone a convenient outside thing to blame, so nobody had to look at what's actually going on inside him. The darker side stays locked up, but locked up doesn't mean gone. Chris's potential to cause harm is still there beneath his harmless appearance, kept in check by circumstances that the show has never promised will last forever. Next up is the inherited instability theory. Section 14, Inherited Instability Theory. The inherited instability theory looks at Chris Griffin and basically asks, is he just a younger version of Peter? This theory says Chris has the same emotional ups and downs as his dad, but because he's a teenager without any real power or social standing, it shows up differently. Chris has the same sudden mood swings, the same weird obsessions, and the same ability to explode emotionally that we see in Peter all the time. But while Peter can spread his chaos across all of Quahog because people know him and he has connections, Chris is stuck expressing these same traits in smaller, more limited ways. The scary part is that this doesn't look like Chris just copying his dad's behavior after watching him his whole life. It looks like Chris actually inherited this instability. This matters because it means Chris isn't choosing to be like Peter. He might just be built this way from birth. To really see the connection between Chris and Peter, you have to pay attention to how they both react when similar things happen to them. When Peter runs into something frustrating, he blows it way out of proportion. A small problem becomes a huge crisis that needs some dramatic response, even when the stakes are actually pretty low. Chris does the exact same thing when he gets frustrated. He goes from calm to completely freaking out without any of the in-between steps that most people go through. When Peter gets obsessed with something, whether it's a new hobby or some random idea, he chases it with crazy intensity and ignores any consequences until either he burns out or someone physically stops him. Chris shows this same obsessive streak, getting completely consumed by whatever interest or desire grabs his attention until something forces him to snap out of it. When Peter's mood changes, it happens fast and completely. There's no warning, no gradual shift. He's one thing, and then suddenly he's something totally different. Chris does this too, bouncing between happy and upset without any clear reason that would help the people around him know what's coming. These aren't just similar habits from living in the same house. This looks like the same emotional wiring passed down from father to son through their genes. Movin' Out, Brian's Song, the second episode of Season 6, which aired on September 30th, 2007, really shows this inherited instability when Chris gets a taste of independence for the first time. The episode starts with Chris getting a job at the local grocery store and making enough money to rent an apartment with Stewie as his roommate. You'd think this would be exciting for him, right? But the second Chris faces the idea of being on his own, his behavior gets unstable in ways that look exactly like how Peter handles big life changes. He swings back and forth between being pumped about his freedom and being totally anxious about having responsibilities. He can't find a middle ground between these two feelings.
When something goes wrong in the apartment, Chris reacts with the same over-the-top distress that Peter shows whenever household problems come up at Spooner Street. When something goes right, Chris celebrates way too hard, just like Peter does when minor good things happen to him. The emotional volume is set to the same level in both of them, whether things are going good or bad. The only difference is what sets them off based on their different life situation.
Brian ends up moving into the apartment too, so now you've got Chris's instability mixing with Brian's act of being smarter than everyone and Stewie's manipulative games all in one small space. Surprise, surprise, it falls apart almost immediately, and Chris's mood swings play a big part in why the whole living situation crashes and burns so fast. The real test comes when the independent living experiment completely fails, and Chris has to deal with it without his family there to catch him. How does he handle it? Exactly like Peter handles his failures. He doesn't sit down and think about what went wrong or how to do better next time. He experiences the failure as a total rejection of who he is as a person and spirals into an emotional mess that needs someone else to come fix it. Lois has to come get Chris and bring him back home, basically rescuing him from the fallout of instability he couldn't handle on his own. The episode really highlights something important here. Chris has Peter's mood swings, but he doesn't have Peter's safety net. Peter has Lois to clean up his messes and manage his crises whenever things go sideways. Peter has friends who absorb his chaos and treat his behavior like it's normal. Peter has a job that somehow puts up with his messed up behavior, even though it probably costs them money. Chris has none of that when he's living on his own. When his instability shows itself outside the Griffin house, it creates immediate problems he can't escape or hand off to someone more capable. The instability itself is the same in both father and son. The difference is that Chris doesn't have all the support systems that keep Peter working despite being fundamentally messed up. The episode kind of hints at what Chris's future might look like. A lot depends on whether he builds up similar support systems as he gets older, or whether his instability will cause bigger and bigger problems as he grows into situations that need more stability than he can actually give. The fan response to Movin' Out, Brian's song, mainly focused on how funny it was to see Brian, Chris, and Stewie as unlikely roommates, rather than thinking about what the episode says about Chris and where he might be headed. The episode has a 7.4 rating on IMDb, with reviews praising the character interactions and the comedy that comes from these three mismatched people trying to live together. What didn't get much attention was what the episode shows us about how Chris works when you take him out of the family system that normally keeps his instability in check. Inside the Griffin house, Chris's mood swings get absorbed by a system that was originally built to handle Peter's mood swings over years of marriage. The same coping tools Lois developed for Peter work on Chris too, without anyone having to do anything special. But when Chris leaves that system and tries to be independent, his instability has nowhere to go, and no one around who knows how to deal with it every day. You can see the long-term effects of Chris's inherited instability in how the series basically treats him as Peter's replacement in being a mess, rather than someone who could grow past his father's limitations. Unlike Meg, who the show sometimes hints might escape the Griffin pattern by just surviving long enough to turn 18 and leave, or Stewie, whose genius gives him tools Peter doesn't have for understanding himself, Chris seems destined to just repeat Peter's path without any real changes. He has the same core instability that defines his dad. He doesn't have the intelligence or self-awareness to notice it in himself or work around it. He's grown up thinking the family's mess is just how life works, rather than something that needs to change. This theory says Chris is probably going to become Peter as he gets older, creating the same chaos for the same reasons rooted in who he really is. The inheritance isn't just a tendency to act certain ways that might fade with age. It's basically his fate built into his genes. Chris doesn't choose to be unstable any more than Peter chooses his instability. He's unstable because his father is unstable, and nothing about his character or his situation suggests he has any ability to break the cycle that created him. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the Fragmented Identity Theory. Section 15, Fragmented Identity Theory. The Fragmented Identity Theory takes a look at Chris Griffin and asks a really unsettling question. Is there actually a real Chris underneath all the different versions of him we see throughout the show? This theory says Chris doesn't have a stable core self at all. Instead, he just copies whatever's around him, which leads to constant role switching, copying other people, and a broken sense of self that stops him from ever becoming a consistent person. Unlike characters who stay pretty much the same no matter what situation they're in, Chris just becomes whatever his surroundings tell him he should be, without any pushback or thinking about whether it actually fits him. He takes on different versions of himself based on whoever he's around, whatever show he just watched, or whatever role seems like it might get him accepted right now. This matters because it's not just about a slow teenager figuring himself out. It suggests Chris might be genuinely empty at his center. To get why Chris is different from normal teenage stuff, you have to compare him to how regular teenagers figure out who they are. Most teens try on different looks, interests, and ways of acting while keeping some sense of who they really are underneath. Their memories stay the same, their basic values stick around, and their relationships carry over between experiments. This gives them something to compare new experiences against, so they can figure out what works and what doesn't. They might dress differently for a while, pick up a new hobby, or try acting like a different social group, but there's always some background version of themselves that stays stable enough to judge how these experiments are going and fit them into a story about who they're becoming. Chris shows zero evidence of having that background self anywhere in the series, if you really pay attention. When Chris picks up a new version of himself, the old one just vanishes completely, without leaving anything behind that might help him make better choices later. He doesn't compare who he is now to who he was before. He doesn't think about whether changes are making him better or worse as a person. He just becomes someone totally different, then becomes someone else again when the next influence grabs his attention. This suggests that these different versions aren't masks covering up a real Chris. They might be the only Chris that exists at any given moment. There's no real self hidden underneath all the rotating presentations that might eventually settle down as he matures. The breaking into pieces goes all the way down to his core. Jungle Love, the 13th episode of Season 4, which aired on November 13th, 2005, really shows this broken identity when Chris gets completely transformed after being removed from his normal environment and placed with a native tribe in South America. The episode sends Chris to live with a remote tribe after his behavioral issues become too much to handle at home and the family starts looking for other options. Within basically no time at all among the tribe, Chris adopts their customs, their beliefs, and their ways of living, completely without any apparent effort or resistance to giving up who he was before. He doesn't keep his American identity while learning about another culture like most people would do when visiting somewhere new and different. He becomes a tribal member like his entire previous life in Quahog never existed and has no claim on who he is now. When he announces he wants to marry a tribal girl, the decision shows his total absorption into his new surroundings rather than mixing new experiences with his existing identity in any real way. The Chris who lived in Quahog has been completely replaced by a Chris who belongs to the jungle. This isn't growth or learning, it's one identity being swapped out wholesale for another with nothing connecting them at all. The previous Chris is just gone, and a new Chris lives in his body now, without any connection to who came before or any awareness that something weird has happened. When the family comes to get him and brings him back to Quahog, Chris goes right back to his old patterns, like the jungle experience never happened and left zero lasting impression on him. The tribal Chris disappears just as completely as the Quahog Chris disappeared before him, which pretty much proves neither one was more real than the other. The real proof of broken identity shows up in Extra Large Medium, the 12th episode of Season 8, which aired on February 14th, 2010. The episode has Chris dating a girl named Ellen who has Down syndrome. But more importantly, it shows how Chris builds himself in relationships from scratch, rather than bringing who he already is to share. Chris doesn't come into the relationship with a sense of who he already is and then share that person with Ellen like healthy dating requires. He builds a Chris specifically designed to be Ellen's boyfriend, picking up whatever traits seem like they'll keep her interested and happy, without any connection to what he actually likes or wants. When Ellen turns out to have a more assertive personality than Chris expected, he struggles hard because there's no stable version of himself to fall back on when his constructed act doesn't meet her expectations. He can't work things out or adapt, because working things out needs you to have a position to work from, and adapting needs a self that sticks around through the changes to do the adapting. Chris doesn't have either of these things available to him. All he can do is try to build a new version of himself that might work better. And when that fails, build another one, in endless cycles, without learning anything from previous attempts. Brian's Got a Brand New Bag, the 4th episode of Season 8, which aired on October 18th, 2009, extends this into how Chris watches other people's relationships and copies their patterns as raw material for building himself, without any filter.
The episode is mainly about Brian dating an older woman named Rita, but Chris's involvement on the side shows his habit of building who he is from watching others, rather than developing himself from the inside or having real preferences of his own. Chris watches Brian's relationship play out and immediately starts adding elements to how he acts, without stopping to think about any of it. He doesn't ask whether Brian's choices are good, appropriate, or even suitable for a teenager rather than an adult dog. He just absorbs it all as available identity material, adding it to his rotating collection of different versions of himself that make up his only self.
The fan response to these episodes mostly focused on the comedy rather than what they tell us about Chris's mind. Jungle Love got good reviews for its cultural jokes and fish out of water comedy, sitting at a 7.6 on IMDb. Extra Large Medium got way more attention for how it portrayed Down syndrome than for what it showed about Chris. Former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin publicly criticized the episode, which created media coverage that completely took over any conversation about what the episode was actually doing. What got lost in all that controversy was how the episode shows Chris's emptiness inside, under the surface comedy. His relationship with Ellen falls apart not because they're too different or don't match as people, but because Chris can't stay consistent long enough to build a real connection with someone who has her own stable sense of who she is. Ellen knows who she is and what she wants. Chris doesn't know who he is because there's no lasting Chris to know or share with anyone else. You can see the long-term effects of Chris's broken identity and how he completely fails to develop across the series in ways that other characters sometimes manage, despite the show's reset everything each episode approach. Peter stays Peter across all episodes, but Peter has a stable self that lasts and can be recognized no matter what situation he's thrown into. Brian's act of being smarter than everyone is consistent enough to count as identity, even though it's fake and annoying. Stewie's change from wanting world domination to having complex emotional needs represents real character growth over time. Chris alone shows no growth at all, because growth needs something to carry over from episode to episode, and Chris has absolutely none. Each episode resets him to whatever the story needs without any reference to how he acted in previous episodes. He can be sensitive or cruel, smart or dumb, confident or nervous, depending entirely on what that particular episode requires in that moment. This flexibility might seem like lazy writing, but the fragmented identity theory says it actually represents Chris's psychology accurately within the show's world. He really is this empty on the inside. He really doesn't have a stable self that carries over between situations. The inconsistency is the character, not a failure to write him consistently. Up next is the Hyperawareness burden theory. Section 16, Hyperawareness burden theory. The Hyperawareness burden theory takes a look at Stewie Griffin and asks whether being super smart might actually hurt him more than it helps. This theory says Stewie's genius creates real suffering, rather than giving him the advantages people usually think come with being smart. Stewie sees reality way more clearly than any other family member can, understanding social games, spotting when people are being fake, and knowing how things will play out while everyone else remains clueless. This should, in theory, make his life easier. Instead, it makes him isolated, unhappy, and constantly unsatisfied in ways his intelligence can't fix, no matter how hard he tries. This matters because it shows that Stewie's genius isn't the gift it looks like on the surface. It's actually a weight that cuts him off from the comfortable ignorance everyone else in his family gets to enjoy. To understand the burden that comes with being super aware of everything, you have to look at what Stewie notices that everyone else completely misses. Peter moves through his days without noticing the chaos he creates or the people he hurts along the way. This cluelessness actually protects Peter from guilt, regret, and the kind of deep questioning that would make his simple pleasures way more complicated. Lois runs the household without ever looking at whether her life choices gave her outcomes worth all the sacrifices. Chris floats through existence without the self-awareness that would show him his own limitations. Brian holds on to his fake smart guy act that Stewie can see right through, but that Brian genuinely believes. Stewie is the only one smart enough to recognize all these patterns, understand what they mean, and see the weirdness underneath family life that everyone else accepts as normal. This awareness completely cuts him off from the people he lives with. He can't share what he sees because nobody would get it. He can't act on what he understands because he's still stuck in a baby's body, totally dependent on people whose limitations he sees with painful clarity every day. Chitty Chitty Death Bang, the third episode of Season 1, which aired on April 18th, 1999, sets up the burden of being super aware through how Stewie reacts to his first birthday party and the crisis it triggers. The episode reveals that Stewie thinks a man in a white coat is coming to put him back in the womb, a belief that comes from his traumatic birth and his awareness of a cult tracking him since he was born. While the family gets ready for a party focused on balloons and cake, Stewie experiences genuine terror about death and whether he'll continue to exist that nobody else in the room can understand. He's not scared of the party itself. He's scared of what the party means about time passing, about how vulnerable he is, and about forces he can't control, even though his intelligence lets him see them coming. The gap between the family's cheerful cluelessness and Stewie's deep, scary thoughts about life and death really highlights the burden his awareness creates. Peter and Lois see a baby turning 1 and think it's a happy occasion. Stewie sees himself getting closer to death while surrounded by people who can't understand what that means. His intelligence doesn't protect him from being mortal. It just guarantees he'll think about mortality way deeper than anyone around him while they enjoy cake without a care in the world. The real proof of how being super aware is a burden comes in The Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou, the 11th episode of Season 5, which aired on February 18th, 2007. The episode is about Stewie getting bullied by a bigger kid at the park, which sounds like a basic childhood problem, but becomes so much more for someone with Stewie's brain. For a regular baby, getting bullied would just cause simple upset that parents could comfort away. For Stewie, the experience kicks off a complete breakdown of power dynamics, social rankings of who's above who, and the random cruelty that shows up in human interaction at every level. He doesn't just feel hurt by what happened. He understands exactly why the bully picked him as a target, what needs the bully meets by pushing around smaller kids, and how this exact dynamic repeats throughout all of human society. His intelligence transforms a normal childhood difficulty into evidence about how life works at its core. Peter tries to help by teaching Stewie how to fight back, but Peter's approach shows his own limitations. Peter sees bullying as a simple problem with a simple solution. Stewie sees it as an example of patterns that will define his whole life, regardless of whether he beats this particular bully. When Stewie finally stands up to his bully, winning feels empty because his awareness tells him another bully will show up, and another after that, forever. The cycle never ends because it's baked into human nature. Peter celebrates like the problem is solved. Stewie knows better, but can't explain what he knows to someone who isn't capable of understanding. The Big Bang Theory, the 16th episode of Season 9, which aired on May 17th, 2011, takes the burden of being super aware to universe levels through Stewie's role in actually creating the universe during a time travel adventure. The episode reveals that Stewie's fight with Bertram caused the Big Bang that created everything that exists. Stewie literally made the universe happen. You'd think this knowledge would make him feel important, or give his life meaning bigger than normal experience. Instead, it just adds more weight to his burden. He now knows his existence is a loop, that he created himself by doing things he had to do because he already existed to do them. This weird loop doesn't provide any comfort. It just gives him awareness that even creating the universe can't provide the meaning he's looking for. Stewie created everything and still feels empty inside. The episode shows that no accomplishment, no matter how universe-changing, fixes the suffering that comes from being so aware. Other characters would never even think about whether they caused the Big Bang. Stewie not only thinks about it, but has to live with knowing that he did. And that knowledge changes nothing about his daily experience of being alone and unsatisfied. The fan response to The Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou mainly focused on the Life Aquatic parody stuff and Peter's attempts at being a dad, rather than what Stewie goes through in his mind. The episode has a 7.6 rating on IMDb, with reviews praising the humor and cultural references. What got less attention was how the episode shows Stewie's intelligence transforming ordinary kid experiences into sources of heavy weight about life that most children never have to carry. The bullying storyline could have been simple comedy about a baby fighting back. Instead, the episode shows Stewie processing what happened through an understanding that adds layers of meaning his family can't see. His win over the bully doesn't feel satisfying the way it does for Peter, because Stewie sees beyond the immediate victory. He sees the pattern continuing forever, and the burden staying with him no matter what happens. You can see the long-term effects of Stewie's burden of being super aware and how he gradually shifts across seasons from world domination plans to showing his emotions and wanting connection. Early Stewie thought his intelligence could solve his problems if he applied it the right way. Later, Stewie realizes that intelligence itself might be the problem, or at least the source of problems that no amount of smarts can solve.
His relationship with Brian becomes more important not in spite of his genius, but because of it. Brian is the only family member who sometimes engages with Stewie at something close to his level.
The burden of noticing everything has taught Stewie that understanding everything doesn't provide comfort. Connection with other people, even flawed people like Brian, gives him what understanding can't. He doesn't see intelligence as an advantage anymore. He sees it as the weight he has to carry, the curse he can't escape, and the wall between him and the simple happiness his family enjoys without any effort or awareness of how lucky they are. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the self-replacing identity theory. Section 17, self-replacing identity theory. The self-replacing identity theory looks at Stewie Griffin's time travel adventures and asks a question that most viewers never stop to think about. Which Stewie is actually the real Stewie? This theory says Stewie has multiple versions of himself scattered across different timelines and alternate realities, creating an identity mess that no other character goes through or could even wrap their head around. Through all his time travel trips and exploring different universes, Stewie has met other Stewies, erased timelines that had versions of himself in them, and made choices that swapped one Stewie for another without any clear line connecting them. The question of which Stewie is real doesn't have a solid answer because asking it assumes there's one ongoing self, and Stewie's experiences have made that impossible. This matters because it shows that Stewie's identity isn't just complicated, it might not even exist as a single thing anymore after everything he's been through. To understand this whole self-replacing thing, you have to think about how Stewie's time travel creates problems that nobody has ever actually dealt with before, because no one has really lived through this stuff until Stewie. When Stewie goes back in time and changes things, he makes a new timeline where a different Stewie exists. The Stewie who made the changes, and the Stewie who comes out of those changes, aren't the same person in any real sense. They share some memories, but not others. They made different choices because they grew up in different situations. When Stewie comes back to a present that's been changed by what he did in the past, he becomes the Stewie of that new present, but the Stewie he was before basically stops existing. This has happened multiple times throughout the series. Every time it happens, it replaces one Stewie with another, while keeping the appearance that everything connects that viewers accept, but that Stewie himself has to recognize as fake if he actually thinks about it. He knows he's replaced himself over and over through his adventures. He knows that Stewie having these thoughts might not be the same Stewie who existed yesterday if time changes happened overnight while everyone was sleeping. Back to the pilot, the 5th episode of Season 10, which aired on November 13th, 2011, really shows this self-replacing thing when Stewie and Brian travel to the first episode of Family Guy, and their presence sets off a chain reaction of timeline changes. The episode starts with Brian and Stewie going back to January 31st, 1999 to find a tennis ball Brian buried in the backyard years ago. Just being there in the past creates changes they didn't mean to make. Brian tells his past self about the September 11th attacks, hoping to stop them. This creates a new timeline where Brian prevented 9/11 and became a national hero. But what came after led to a devastating nuclear war that wrecked civilization. Stewie and Brian have to keep jumping through time, trying to fix the damage, making more new timelines with each attempt to make things right. By the end of the episode, they've made multiple versions of reality, with multiple versions of themselves. And most of those got erased by later changes that overwrote what came before. The Stewie who comes back to the present isn't the Stewie who left at the start of the episode. He's been overwritten by timeline changes that altered his history, even though he still remembers the original version that doesn't exist anymore. The episode plays all this for laughs, but what it means is pretty disturbing if you actually think about it. Stewie has basically killed versions of himself through his time travel choices, and replace them with versions he finds more acceptable or convenient. The biggest example of this self-replacing thing comes in Road to the Multiverse, the first episode of Season 8, which aired on September 27th, 2009. The episode takes Stewie and Brian through a bunch of alternate universes, using a device Stewie built, and each universe has a different version of reality, with a different version of Stewie, who grew up according to that universe's rules. They visit a universe where dogs run things and humans are pets, with the power dynamic flipped. They see a universe drawn like a Disney cartoon, where everyone is cheerful and breaks into song. They find a universe with realistic physics where disturbing versions of the characters exist that look nothing like their cartoon selves.
They pass through tons of other variations that each have their own Stewie, living their own complete life.
Each universe has a Stewie who turned out differently based on that universe's rules and history. The Disney Stewie is happy and musical in ways regular Stewie would find gross. The realistic Stewie is creepy and unsettling to even look at. The dog universe Stewie probably has totally different relationships and goals than the Stewie we watch throughout the series.
The episode makes Stewie face the fact that his identity depends on circumstances rather than being part of who he is deep down. He's not fundamentally Stewie in any way that goes beyond his particular universe's setup.
He's just the Stewie of this universe, one variation among infinite possibilities, no more real or valid than versions he'll never meet who live their own full lives somewhere else. The multiverse device gives Stewie power over reality, but at the same time destroys any stable sense of self he might try to hold on to. He can visit other Stewies, but can't combine them into one single identity. He can only accept that he's one instance of a pattern, replaceable by other instances if circumstances had been even slightly different. Send in Stewie Please, the 12th episode of Season 16, which aired on March 18th, 2018, deals with this self-replacing thing head-on through Stewie's therapy session with a child psychologist, where he actually talks honestly for once. The bottle episode has Stewie talking about his psychology without the usual filters he keeps up around family members who wouldn't get it anyway. He talks about his sexuality, his relationship with Brian, how he feels about his family, and his sense of self in ways he's never shared with anyone before. The therapist asks Stewie who he really is underneath all the different faces he shows to different people. Stewie struggles to answer because after everything he's been through, he genuinely doesn't know anymore. His time travel experiences have broken any stable sense of ongoing self he might have had. His multiverse awareness has destroyed any sense of being unique by showing him he's just one of infinite versions. He tells the therapist about other versions of himself he's met and replaced, about timelines he's erased that had Stewies in them who don't exist anymore because of choices he made. The therapist tries to help him focus on his present identity, but Stewie sees that as random and meaningless. Why should present Stewie be more real than past Stewies he overwrote, or future Stewies who will overwrite him someday? The fan response to Road to the Multiverse was super positive, with the episode getting an 8.8 rating on IMDb, which is among the highest scores in the whole series. Critics loved the creative ambition of the multiverse idea, and the visual variety of different animation styles, showing off what the artists could do. The episode won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, recognizing how impressive it was both technically and creatively. What didn't get as much thought was what the episode means for Stewie's identity across all these infinite variations. The comedy celebrates how many different possible worlds exist, without really looking at what that variety means for any individual Stewie's sense of self or reality. If there are infinite Stewies out there, none of them is uniquely real compared to the others. The Stewie we follow throughout the series isn't the Stewie. He's just a Stewie, different from the others only because of the random accident of which universe the show decided to follow. You can see the long-term effects of Stewie's self-replacing identity in how he focuses more and more on relationships rather than achievements or keeping his identity consistent as the series goes on. Early Stewie went after world domination, thinking power would give him meaning and stability that would make his life feel worth living. Later Stewie goes after connection, especially with Brian, because connection can survive even when identity doesn't make it through timeline changes. If Stewie gets replaced by a different Stewie through time travel stuff, the relationship with Brian might keep going even though the person experiencing it has changed into someone new. His bond with Brian represents something that continues, that he can't find inside himself anymore. This theory suggests Stewie has figured out, whether he realizes it consciously or not, that he can't keep a clear sense of self across his experiences, no matter how hard he tries. All he can do is keep relationships that survive self-replacement, connections that continue no matter which Stewie happens to be filling the role at any given moment. Next up is the friend dependency theory. Section 18, Friend Dependency Theory. The friend dependency theory looks at Stewie Griffin's bond with Brian and finds that it has become the emotional center that everything else in Stewie's life revolves around. This theory says Stewie's connection with Brian has grown into his most important relationship, the one that decides his emotional state, his sense of purpose, and even whether he wants to keep living, more than anything else going on around him. Stewie is super smart, has time travel abilities, and resources that should make him totally independent of any single relationship. Yet, his attachment to Brian has gotten stronger across seasons, to the point where whether Brian is around or not determines how Stewie feels more than any other factor. This matters because it shows that the smartest character in the show has become completely dependent on a friendship that could disappear anytime. To understand this whole dependency thing, you have to look at what Brian gives Stewie that no other relationship in his life can offer. Peter ignores Stewie almost completely, sometimes acknowledging he exists, but never engaging with his intelligence or emotional needs. Lois takes care of him physically, but shows no ability to recognize Stewie's actual personality underneath the baby exterior she sees. Chris isn't smart enough to talk with Stewie about any topic that matters to him. Meg is too caught up in her own survival to notice how complex Stewie actually is. Brian alone treats Stewie like someone on his level, has real conversations with him, goes on adventures with him, and responds to his emotions as real rather than brushing them off as baby behavior. Nobody else can replace this recognition. Stewie has no other source of confirmation that his inner experience matters to anyone. Without Brian, Stewie would have all his intelligence and abilities while having nobody who treats them as real. The dependency formed because Brian filled a need nobody else could fill, and now Stewie can't picture life without it. Road to Rhode Island, the 13th episode of Season 2, which aired on May 30th, 2000, lays the groundwork for this dependency through Stewie and Brian's first big adventure together outside the Griffin house. The episode takes him on a trip to get Brian back from visiting his birthplace, which triggered an emotional crisis about being abandoned by his mother years ago. Stewie comes along not because anyone made him, but because he genuinely cares about how Brian is doing, which he doesn't show toward any other family members. Throughout their journey, Stewie shows way more investment in Brian's emotional state than he ever shows toward family members who've known him longer and should matter more on paper. When Brian gets depressed about his mother dying and not getting closure, Stewie responds with actual comfort rather than mockery. The episode shows that Stewie needs Brian and Brian needs Stewie in ways that go deeper than their surface dynamic of smart dog and evil baby. Their bond formed through shared experience and recognizing each other in ways neither gets anywhere else. Stewie's dependency started here, in finding out someone could really see him and still want to be around him. The clearest example of this dependency comes in Christmas Guy, the 8th episode of Season 12, which aired on December 15th, 2013. The episode deals with the aftermath of Brian's death in Life of Brian, which aired a month earlier and showed Brian getting hit by a car and dying. Brian dying created crazy response from fans, with viewers expressing genuine sadness and anger that the show would kill a beloved character. The episode opens with Stewie still wrecked by losing Brian months later. The family got a new dog named Vinny, but Stewie can't accept the replacement or get past his grief. His dependency on Brian becomes impossible to deny when you see he can't function normally without Brian in his life. When Stewie runs into a past version of himself at the mall who has a time travel device, he sees a chance to save Brian. He steals the return pad from his past self, leaving that Stewie stranded with no way home, and goes back to stop Brian's death. The choice shows how deep the dependency goes. Stewie basically sacrifices another version of himself to bring Brian back. He puts Brian existing above his own timeline making sense, above the other Stewie's ability to get home, above every consideration except having Brian back. When it works and Brian survives, Stewie's reaction confirms everything. Brian isn't just a friend Stewie likes. Brian is the relationship Stewie needs to function at all. The connection he'll sacrifice anything to keep. Brian and Stewie, the 17th episode of Season 8, which aired on May 2nd, 2010, gives us the closest look at this dependency by stripping away all distractions. The bottle episode traps Brian and Stewie in a bank vault overnight with nobody else there and nothing to do except talk. There are no cutaway gags, no other characters, and no plot beyond two friends honestly dealing with their relationship. Stewie shows emotional openness he keeps hidden from everyone else. He admits he thinks about suicide sometimes when things get too hard. He asks Brian why Brian bothers staying alive given all his failures and disappointments. Brian asks Stewie the same thing back. Stewie answers that he would miss Brian too much to die, that Brian is his reason to keep existing. How direct this admission is really hits you. Stewie doesn't say he'd miss his family, or his inventions, or his chances at world domination. He says he'd miss Brian specifically, and that's enough to keep him alive. His dependency on this friendship isn't just preferring one person over others.
It's what keeps him grounded. Brian keeps Stewie alive, literally, by giving him a reason to continue when nothing else does.
The reviews for Brian and Stewie were mixed, with some viewers loving the emotional depth, while others found the format boring without Family Guy's usual comedy and cutaway gags. The episode has a 7.4 rating on IMDb, lower than action-heavy episodes, but higher than much of the season around it. Critics who liked the episode pointed out how it was willing to take the Brian-Stewie relationship seriously, rather than using it as setup for jokes. The episode showed that underneath all the comedy, Stewie's attachment to Brian involves genuine love and dependency that the show had been building for years without fully saying out loud until this moment. This theory finds its clearest evidence right here, because Stewie flat out tells Brian that Brian is why he lives. You can see the long-term effects of Stewie's dependency on Brian in how his character has changed around the Brian relationship rather than developing on his own. Early Stewie chased world domination as his main goal, with Brian sometimes being a companion and sometimes an obstacle. Later, Stewie has mostly dropped the domination plans in favor of adventures with Brian, working through emotions with Brian, and protecting his connection from whatever might threaten it. His intelligence is still there, but what he cares about has reorganized around his friend rather than power or accomplishment. This theory suggests this change represents being healthier rather than weakness, even though it creates vulnerability. Stewie figured out that his other goals couldn't give him what he needed. Power wouldn't fix his loneliness. Achievement wouldn't solve his confusion about who he is. Only connection could deal with the burdens his intelligence created, and Brian gave him that connection consistently. The dependency makes sense, given everything Stewie deals with. He needs Brian because he genuinely can't keep himself going without Brian, and recognizing that need shows wisdom rather than weakness. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.